Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the candlelit chaos of Regency England. Not the sparkling ballrooms of Bridgerton, but the real ones. The ones that started elegant at 8 and devolved into something closer to a frat party by midnight. We're talking sweat-soaked silk, wandering hands, scandalous whispers, and at least one duke face down in the punch bowl. So before you slip into your imaginary empire waistgown, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your curiosity helps shape this channel, and I genuinely appreciate it. Now, the channel's also live on Spotify. If you want to take these stories on the go, links in the description. Dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe loosen your corset because tonight's going to get messy. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what really happened when the chaperones got tired and the orchestra packed up? Did debutantes actually faint from tight lacing, or was that just a convenient excuse to get carried off by a handsome stranger? What did people eat at 3 in the morning when they were too drunk to remember their own names? How did you sneak off for a scandalous rendezvous in a house with 47 gossiping aunts? And what on earth did they do about all that sweat in an era before deodorant? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1813, and you've been invited to a ball at the Duke of Devonshire's estate. Your dance card is full, your reputation is spotless, and the night is young. By dawn, at least one of those things will no longer be true. Good luck. Let's talk about how you even got into this mess. Regency balls weren't open to just anyone with a decent pair of shoes and a vague sense of rhythm. No, these were carefully curated events where your invitation, or lack thereof, could make or break your entire social standing. If your name appeared on the guest list, you were someone. If it didn't, well, enjoy your evening at home with your embroidery and crushing disappointment. Receiving an invitation was like getting a golden ticket, except instead of a chocolate factory, you won access to a room full of judgment, gossip, and questionable punch. The hostess, usually a duchess, countess, or someone with enough money to pretend they mattered, would sit at her writing desk weeks in advance, quill in hand, deciding who was worthy of her candlelight and champagne. This wasn't a democratic process. This was social warfare disguised as calligraphy. Your family's reputation mattered enormously. If your father was a respectable gentleman with land and title, you were in. If your uncle had recently been involved in a gambling scandal, or your sister had run off with the stable boy, well, suddenly the hostess ran out of space on her guest list. One whispered rumour about impropriety could see your entire family, scratched off every invitation in London faster than you could say social ruin. And the invitations themselves? Works of art, heavy cardstock, elegant script, sealed with wax bearing the family crest. They arrived by footman, delivered directly into your trembling hands like a decree from the heavens. Opening one felt like unwrapping fate itself. You'd scan the details, date, time, dress code, and immediately begin calculating. Who else would be there? Would he be there? Would she be there? Could this be the night you finally secured a husband, or at least a decent dance partner who didn't step on your feet? But here's where it gets interesting. Not all invitations were equal. Some guests received theirs weeks in advance, a sign of their importance and the hostess's eagerness to secure their attendance. Others received theirs days before the event, almost as an afterthought, like being invited to a birthday party because your mum made someone include you. The timing of your invitation told you exactly where you stood in the social pecking order, and everyone knew it. And then there were the people who showed up uninvited. Bold, desperate, or foolish. Take your pick. They'd arrive at the door, claim their invitation must have been lost in the post, and hope the chaos of the evening would allow them to slip inside unnoticed. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes they were turned away at the door by a stone-faced butler who took immense pleasure in his gatekeeping duties. It was humiliating either way. If you were a young lady making your debut, that first invitation was everything. It announced to society that you were officially on the marriage market, ready to be inspected, evaluated, and either claimed or dismissed. No pressure. Your mother would clutch that invitation like it was the deed to a country estate, already planning your dress, your hair, your strategy for capturing the attention of every eligible bachelor in the room. The invitation wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a referendum on your worth, your family's standing, and your future. It was proof that you mattered, or at least that someone thought you might. And once you held it in your hands, there was no turning back. You were going to that ball, come hell, high water, or a last-minute smallpox outbreak. Because in Regency England, being invited wasn't just an honour. It was survival. You can't just throw on a gown and waltz into a Regency ball. Oh no. Getting dressed for one of these events was a full-contact sport involving at least 2 maids, whalebone, and a prayer that you wouldn't pass out before the first dance. Your corset was laced so tight your internal organs rearranged themselves like Tetris blocks, and your gown weighed roughly as much as a small child. Let's start with the foundation, the dreaded corset. This wasn't some dainty piece of lingerie you could slip on while checking your phone. This was a structured cage of whalebone, wood, and sheer determination, designed to squeeze your torso into an hourglass shape, whether your body wanted to cooperate or not. Your maid, or if you were fancy, 2 maids, would position you in front of a bedpost or sturdy chair, thread the laces through the back, and then pull, hard, like they were trying to lace up a particularly stubborn boot. You'd grip the bedpost, suck in every available breath, and try not to whimper as your ribs compressed and your internal organs filed formal complaints. The goal was a waist so tiny that men would marvel and women would seethe with envy. The reality was that you could barely breathe, couldn't sit comfortably, and lived in constant fear of bending over and having the whole contraption snap apart like a cheap guitar string. Once your torso was sufficiently imprisoned, it was time for the layers. First, the chemise, a thin linen shift that was supposed to protect your skin from the corset, but mostly just absorbed sweat. Then came the petticoats, multiple petticoats. So many petticoats that you started to feel like a walking upholstery project. Each one added volume, structure, and approximately 15 pounds to your overall weight. Walking required strategy. Stairs became a calculated risk. And then, finally, the gown itself. Regency gowns were deceptively simple-looking from a distance. High waistlines, flowing skirts, delicate fabrics. But up close, they were engineering marvels. Silk, satin, muslin, all carefully draped, tucked, and pinned to create an illusion of effortless elegance. Except there was nothing effortless about it. The fabric clung to every curve the corset had created, and any bulge, bump, or imperfection was on full display. Your maid would ease the gown over your head, careful not to disturb your elaborately arranged hair. We'll get to that nightmare in a moment, and then begin the process of fastening. Tiny buttons down the back, dozens of them, each one requiring the patience of a saint and the dexterity of a surgeon. If one popped mid-evening, you were done for. There was no graceful way to explain why your gown was gaping open in the middle of a quadrille. Then came the accessories, gloves that reached past your elbows, so tight you could barely bend your fingers. Jewellery, pearls, if you were respectable. Garnets, or emeralds, if you were wealthy. Paste, if you were neither but had to pretend. A fan, which was both a fashion statement and a survival tool for when the room got too hot. A reticule, a tiny useless purse that couldn't hold anything larger than a handkerchief and maybe a mint. And slippers so thin you could feel every pebble, crack, and cold marble tile through the sole. And your hair? Oh, Your hair was its own 3-hour ordeal, curled with hot irons, pinned into elaborate arrangements, adorned with ribbons, feathers, or flowers depending on what was fashionable that season. One wrong move and the whole thing could collapse, leaving you looking like you'd been caught in a windstorm. By the time you were fully dressed, you were exhausted, uncomfortable, and already regretting your life choices. But you looked magnificent, like a porcelain doll, expensive, fragile, and slightly terrifying. And now, you just had to survive the next 8 hours without fainting, ripping, or sweating through all those carefully constructed layers. Good luck. The moment your carriage pulls up to the estate, every eye turns toward you. This is your moment, your chance to glide gracefully up the marble steps, head held high, looking like you were born to wear silk and diamonds. Of course, reality is less graceful. Your heel catches on your hem, someone steps on your train, and you're already sweating through your chemise before you've even made it through the door. Let's set the scene. It's evening, and the estate is lit up like a small sun. Torches line the driveway, chandeliers blaze through every window, and the sound of violins drifts out into the night like a siren call. Your carriage inches forward in a long queue of other carriages, all filled with equally nervous, overdressed guests. You wait, and wait, and wait. Because apparently, making a grand entrance requires excellent timing and the patience of a medieval monk. When your carriage finally reaches the front steps, a footman in immaculate livery opens the door and offers his gloved hand. You take it, trying to look confident and ethereal as you step down onto the gravel. Except your gown weighs 40 pounds, your shoes have zero traction, and you're essentially stepping out of a box while blind because your massive skirts block your view of your own feet. It's a miracle anyone makes it out of the carriage without face planting, but you don't. You manage to emerge, upright and relatively dignified. Your gown unfurls behind you like the train of a very anxious bride, and you begin the ascent up the stone steps. This is where things get tricky. The steps are wide, shallow, and slippery from the evening dew. You're wearing slippers with the structural integrity of tissue paper, and behind you your mother is hissing whispered instructions. Shoulders back, chin up, don't look at your feet. Smile, for heaven's sake. Every step is a tightrope act. Too fast and you'll trip. Too slow and you'll look timid. You grip your fan like it's a life raft and focus on not dying. Around you, other guests are navigating the same treacherous path, some with grace, others with the desperation of someone who knows they're one wrong step away from viral humiliation. 1813. Style. As you reach the top of the steps, you're greeted by the butler, a stern, imposing figure who looks like he was carved from marble and disappointment. He announces your name to the receiving line in a booming voice that echoes through the entrance hall, and suddenly every conversation stops. Every head turns. Every eye evaluates you in the span of a heartbeat. Are you wearing the right colours? Is your hair fashionable? Is that your real jewellery or paste? Are you someone worth knowing, or someone to be politely ignored? You curtsy to the hostess, a deep, elegant curtsy that requires balance, poise, and knees that don't crack audibly. She greets you with a smile that may or may not be genuine, murmurs something gracious, and then you're released into the wild. You've made it. You're inside. You're officially at the ball. And the night, with all its promise and peril, stretches out before you like a glittering, terrifying battlefield. But first, you have to make it across the entrance hall without tripping over someone else's train, bumping into a marble statue, or accidentally walking into a conversation you weren't invited to join, because the arrival might be over, but the real performance? That's just beginning. Step inside and prepare to be dazzled, and not in a good way. The ballroom is a fever dream of chandeliers dripping with candles, mirrors reflecting every unflattering angle, and approximately 300 people crammed into a space designed for 200. The heat is immediate and oppressive, like walking into a greenhouse staffed entirely by peacocks. The first thing that hits you is the sheer sensory overload. Light everywhere, hundreds of candles suspended from chandeliers, flickering in wall sconces, reflected endlessly in gilded mirrors. It's bright enough to give you a headache and hot enough to melt your carefully applied rouge. The air shimmers with heat, and you can already feel the first bead of sweat forming at the back of your neck. Attractive. Then there's the noise. Not just the orchestra, though they're soaring away enthusiastically in the corner, but the roar of conversation. 300 people trying to be heard over 300 other people creates a wall of sound that's part elegant soiree, part outdoor market. Laughter, shrieks, gossip, greetings, and the occasional scandalized gasp all blend into a symphony of chaos. The ballroom itself is enormous, but somehow still feels crowded. The dance floor occupies the center, a polished expanse of parquet that gleams dangerously under all that candlelight. Around the edges, clusters of chairs and settees provide seating for chaperones, wallflowers, and anyone whose feet have already given up. Potted palms and floral arrangements the size of small trees dot the perimeter, providing convenient hiding spots for gossips and illicit conversations. And the people. Oh, the people. A kaleidoscope of silk, satin, feathers and jewels. The women look like exotic birds, their gowns in every colour imaginable: ivory, blush, lavender, deep emerald, sapphire blue. Their jewellery catches the candlelight and throws it back in dazzling sparks. The men, by contrast, are studies in restraint: dark tailcoats, white cravats, buff-coloured breeches, and Hessian boots polished to a mirror shine. They look elegant and vaguely uncomfortable, like penguins at a formal dinner. But here's what no one tells you about Regency ballrooms. They're essentially beautiful traps. That gleaming floor, slippery as ice, especially after a few hundred people have trampled across it in their outdoor shoes. Those mirrors, positioned to catch every angle, every flaw, every moment of awkwardness. You can't escape your own reflection, which means neither can anyone else. If your hair starts to fall, if your hem rips, if your face turns an unflattering shade of pink from the heat, everyone will know. And the heat. Let's talk about the heat. 300 people, hundreds of candles, zero ventilation, and everyone wearing multiple layers of wool, silk, and whalebone. The temperature climbs steadily as the night wears on, turning the ballroom into a slow-roasting oven. Windows might be cracked open, but it's never enough. The air becomes thick, humid, perfumed with sweat masked by lavender water and desperation. You stand at the edge of the ballroom, taking it all in, the swirl of dancers, the crush of bodies, the glittering spectacle of wealth and status on full display. It's beautiful, it's overwhelming, it's terrifying, and you're about to step into it, armed with nothing but your dance card, your wits, and the faint hope that you won't humiliate yourself before midnight. Welcome to the ballroom. Try not to faint. Every young lady at a Regency ball came equipped with her own personal chaperone. Usually an older female relative whose sole job was to hover nearby like a judgmental ghost, making sure you didn't do anything remotely interesting. They watched your every move, who you danced with, who you spoke to, how long you lingered by the punch bowl, and whether you laughed too loudly. Your chaperone was typically your mother, an aunt, or a family friend. Someone respectable, stern, and deeply invested in making sure you didn't ruin the family name in a single evening of poor judgment. She positioned herself strategically, close enough to monitor, far enough to give the illusion of independence. But make no mistake, you were never truly alone. Her eyes tracked you like a hawk watching a particularly foolish rabbit. The rules were clear. You could dance, but only with gentlemen who'd been properly introduced. You could converse, but only in public spaces where every word could be overheard. You could accept refreshments, but only from appropriate hands. You absolutely could not wander off to the terrace, disappear into the garden, or slip into darkened corridors, no matter how tempting the prospect. Your chaperone's job was to prevent scandal, and she took it seriously. If a gentleman approached you, your chaperone evaluated him instantly. Title, reputation, financial standing, scandal in the family. She had a mental database of every eligible bachelor in the room, and most of the ineligible ones too. If she approved, she'd nod almost imperceptibly, giving you permission to engage. If she disapproved, she'd swoop in with the social grace of a guillotine, intercepting the conversation with a smile and a firm, "I believe we're needed elsewhere." And she wasn't just watching you, she was watching everyone else watch you. If another woman's eyes lingered too long, cataloguing your dress or your dance partners, your chaperone noted it. If a gentleman's gaze turned predatory, she positioned herself between you like a human shield. If gossip started to circulate, she heard it before you did and began damage control immediately. But here's the thing about chaperones, they were only human. As the night wore on and the heat intensified, even the most vigilant guardian started to flag. Around midnight, after hours of standing, watching, and probably refusing to admit they needed to sit down, chaperones began to drift. Some found chairs and dozed off behind their fans. Others got distracted by conversations with fellow chaperones, swapping gossip and comparing notes on whose daughter was doing well and whose was a lost cause. This was the window of opportunity, the brief dangerous period when the surveillance system had gaps, when a young lady could slip away for just a moment, when a gentleman could steal a private word, when rules could be bent if not quite broken. Smart couples waited for this moment. Reckless ones didn't wait at all. But even exhausted, even distracted, chaperones had a sixth sense for trouble. The moment something felt off, a daughter missing for too long, a suspicious glance, a whispered conversation that stopped abruptly when she approached, they snapped back to full alert. Because the consequences of failure weren't just social embarrassment. A ruined reputation could destroy a family, end marriage prospects, and leave a young woman with no future but spinsterhood and regret. So yes, chaperones were surveillance systems, but they were also protectors, however suffocating their methods. Because in a world where a single mistake could cost everything, someone had to stand, guard, even if it meant hovering, watching, and making absolutely sure you didn't have any fun. Your dance card wasn't just a schedule, it was a public declaration of your desirability. If it was full by the second waltz, congratulations, you were the belle of the ball. If it remained tragically blank while everyone else twirled past you, well, that was its own special kind of torture. And once a gentleman signed your card, you were contractually obligated to dance with him, even if he had 2 left feet and breath like a gin distillery. The dance card itself was a small, elegant booklet, usually made of ivory, mother of pearl or decorated cardstock, attached to your wrist or waist by a delicate ribbon or cord. Inside were blank lines corresponding to each dance of the evening. Beside each line, a gentleman would inscribe his name, a binding social contract that you would grant him that specific dance. No backing out, no excuses, no claiming a sudden headache unless you wanted to be, labelled a liar and a flirt. From the moment you arrived, the race was on. Eligible gentlemen circled like well-dressed sharks, sizing up the prospects, evaluating dance cards, making strategic decisions about which ladies to approach. The most desirable young women, those with beauty, wealth, or impressive family connections, would find their cards filling up within minutes. A gentleman would bow, request a dance, and with your chaperone's nod of approval, Add his name to your card with a flourish. But here's where it gets complicated. The order of dances mattered. The first and last dances of the evening were the most prestigious. To grant someone the opening dance signalled favour, interest, perhaps even a budding courtship. To grant someone the final dance suggested intimacy, a private understanding, maybe even an informal arrangement. People noticed, people talked, and then there were the middle dances, less meaningful but still important. 2 dances with the same gentleman in one evening was considered significant, bordering on scandalous. It suggested a particular attachment, an understanding that went beyond casual socializing. Chaperones kept meticulous count. If a gentleman tried to claim a third dance, he'd be politely but firmly redirected. Rules were rules. For young ladies whose dance cards remained empty, the evening became a special kind of agony. You'd stand at the edge of the ballroom, card dangling uselessly from your wrist, watching as everyone else spun and laughed and enjoyed themselves. Your chaperone would try to look encouraging, but you could see the worry in her eyes. An empty dance card wasn't just embarrassing. It was a public announcement of your failure to attract male attention. Some girls developed strategies. They'd arrive late, giving the impression they were in such demand that gentlemen had already claimed dances in advance. Others would linger near popular groups, hoping to be drawn into conversation and noticed. The desperate ones would have brothers or cousins sign their cards just to avoid the humiliation of blank lines, though everyone could spot a pity dance from across the room. And then there were the complicated politics of refusal. If a gentleman requested a dance and you declined, claiming fatigue, a previous commitment, or a twisted ankle, you absolutely could not dance with anyone else for the rest of the evening. To do so would be a public insult, suggesting his company was so objectionable that you'd rather sit out entirely than be seen with him. Rejecting a dance wasn't just rude, it was a social grenade. Men had their own calculations. Sign a card too enthusiastically, and you might be seen as overeager, desperate, or worse, seriously interested in courting. Be too selective and you'd be labelled arrogant or disinterested in marriage. Everything was a signal, everything had meaning, and your dance card was the ledger where it all played out. By the end of the night, your dance card told a story. Who had claimed you? When? And how many times? It was evidence, documentation, a social resume that could be analysed, gossiped about, and used to determine your status in the complex hierarchy of Regency society. It was just a piece of decorated cardboard attached to a ribbon. But in that glittering ballroom, it might as well have been a passport to your future. The first dance of the evening was always the quadrille, a complicated group dance that required precision, memory, and the ability to not accidentally kick your partner. It looked elegant from a distance, but up close it was controlled chaos. People bumped into each other, forgot the steps, and occasionally collided with such force that jewels went flying. The quadrille wasn't just a dance, it was a test of your memory, your grace, your ability to count music, and your tolerance for being in extremely close proximity to 7 other people while executing synchronized movements. 4 couples formed a square on the dance floor, facing each other like competitors in a very polite boxing match. The music started, and suddenly you were expected to remember a complex series of figures, changes and patterns that you'd supposedly practiced but definitely hadn't. The opening figure was simple enough. Honours to your partner, honours to the couple across from you, a little bow, a little curtsy, everyone smiling like this was all perfectly natural. But then the music picked up, and things got complicated fast. Forward and back, side to side, allemande left, ladies' chain, right and left through, and for the love of all that was holy, please remember to turn in the correct direction. It looked effortless when performed correctly. Dancers flowed like water, gowns swirling, feet moving in perfect time, faces serene, but get even slightly out of sync and the entire formation collapse like a house of cards. One person turns the wrong way, and suddenly you're facing the back of someone's head instead of your partner. Someone counts wrong, and the whole line crashes into each other like dominoes in evening wear, and the collisions. Oh, the collisions. Elbows connected with ribs, feet got stepped on with alarming frequency, hems got caught under heels, leading to small ripping sounds that made everyone wince. In the tighter figures, where couples passed closely, fans got knocked out of hands, jewellery caught on coat buttons, and occasionally someone's elaborate hairstyle took a hit from an enthusiastic arm movement. The key was to maintain composure no matter what happened. If you tripped, you smiled through it. If someone stomped on your foot, you didn't yelp. You merely adjusted your expression into something between serene acceptance and martyrdom. If you completely forgot the next figure, you watched the couple next to you like a student cheating on an exam and copied their movements half a beat behind. For gentlemen, the quadrille was a different kind of torture. Not only did they have to remember the steps, and most of them would rather be in the card room gambling away their inheritance, but they also had to guide their partners through the figures without making it obvious that they were desperately trying to remember what came next. A strong lead could save a faltering lady. A weak lead left both partners floundering in the middle of the floor while everyone watched, and people were definitely watching. The opening quadrille was prime observation time. Chaperones evaluated pairings. Gossips took mental notes on who danced well together and who looked miserable. Marriage-minded mothers scrutinized every interaction, looking for signs of compatibility or disaster. Every mistake, every misstep, every awkward moment was catalogued for later discussion. But when it worked, when all four couples moved in perfect synchronization, when the music and the motion aligned, when everyone remembered their steps and no one collided, there was a brief shining moment of pure elegance. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The dancers seemed to float. And for just a second the chaos fell away, and it actually looked like the romantic fantasy everyone pretended it was. Then someone inevitably stepped on someone else's hem, a gentleman turned the wrong direction, and the whole beautiful illusion shattered back into reality. But that's what made the quadrille memorable. Not the perfection, but the barely controlled disaster. The shared relief when the final figure ended and everyone could bow, curtsy, and escape the floor without permanent injury. Welcome to Regency dancing. Try not to break anything. Then came the waltz, and suddenly things got spicy. This was the only dance where a man could put his hand on a woman's waist, gasp, and hold her, while they spun around the room. For Regency society, this was basically softcore choreography. Chaperones watched with narrowed eyes, gossips whispered behind fans, and if you waltzed with the wrong person, your reputation could be shredded faster than you could say ruined. Before the waltz was introduced to English ballrooms in the early 1800s, dancing was a polite arm's-length affair. Partners barely touched. They bowed, stepped, circled, and maintained a respectable distance at all times. Then along came this scandalous import from Germany and Austria, where apparently people had lost all sense of propriety, and suddenly men were putting their hands on women's waists and spinning them around in close embrace. The horror, the absolute indecency of it all. When the waltz first appeared in London, it caused an uproar. Moral authorities denounced it as lewd and corrupting. The Times published articles warning about its dangerous intimacy. Mothers forbade their daughters from participating. But like all forbidden things, the waltz was irresistible. By 1813, it had become fashionable, though still controversial. Young ladies who waltzed were considered bold, modern, perhaps a touch fast. Young ladies who refused were seen as prudish or hopelessly old-fashioned. To be granted permission to waltz, a young lady needed approval, either from the patronesses of Almack's, the most exclusive assembly rooms in London, or from her chaperone at private balls. This approval wasn't given lightly. It signalled that you were mature enough, sophisticated enough, and trusted enough to engage in such an intimate dance without losing your head or your virtue. Once the music started, the couples took their positions. The gentleman placed his right hand on the lady's waist. Shocking, thrilling, terrifying. She placed her left hand on his shoulder, their other hands clasped, and then they were off, spinning across the floor in three-quarter time, impossibly close, dangerously close, close enough to feel each other's breath, to catch the scent of cologne or lavender water, to make eye contact and hold it for longer than was strictly appropriate. The physical sensation was overwhelming. After hours of dances where you barely touched your partner, the waltz was like sensory overload. His hand on your waist, warm through the thin silk of your gown, your hand on his shoulder, feeling the muscle beneath his tailcoat, the spinning, the momentum, the way the room blurred into streaks of candlelight and colour. It was easy to see why people found it scandalous. This wasn't dancing, this was an experience. For gentlemen, the waltz required skill and confidence. You had to lead firmly but not aggressively, guide your partner through the turns without flinging her into other couples or the potted palms. You had to maintain the correct distance, close enough to be properly scandalous, not so close that her chaperone would materialize between you like an avenging angel. And you had to make conversation, because dead silence while holding a woman that close was somehow even more awkward than the intimacy itself. For ladies, the waltz was both exhilarating and terrifying. You had to trust your partner to lead, to not send you spinning into a column or over someone's foot. You had to maintain your composure even as the room whirled and your heart raced. From the exertion, obviously, not from the proximity to an attractive man, definitely not that. You had to look graceful, effortless, like being held and spun by a near stranger was the most natural thing in the world, and everyone was watching. Chaperones tracked which couples seemed too comfortable together, which gentlemen held their partners too tightly, which ladies looked too flushed, too happy, too intimate. 2 waltzes with the same partner in one evening was tantamount to a declaration. 3 was unthinkable. If you waltzed that often with someone, you were either engaged, about to be engaged, or the subject of very serious gossip. The waltz lasted only a few minutes, but it could change everything. Friendships turned into courtships. Polite acquaintances became something more, complicated. And occasionally, rarely, 2 people would realize mid-spin that they'd just found someone worth scandalizing society for. The waltz wasn't just a dance. It was a revelation. 3 minutes of permitted intimacy in a world that usually kept men and women strictly separated. No wonder everyone was so scandalized, and no wonder everyone wanted to try it. There was no DJ booth, no Spotify playlist, just a live orchestra crammed into a corner, soaring away at violins and pounding on pianos for hours on end. The musicians didn't get breaks, they just kept playing, fueled by sheer stubbornness and possibly gin. The music was beautiful, yes, but also relentless, a constant soundtrack to the madness unfolding on the dance floor. The orchestra consisted of anywhere from 5 to 20 musicians, depending on the wealth and status of the host. A modest ball might have a string quartet, 2 violins, a viola and a cello, plus a piano. A grand ball at a ducal estate would boast a full ensemble. Violins, violas, cellos, double bass, flutes, clarinets, French horns, and a harpsichord or pianoforte. These musicians were professionals, hired specifically for the evening, and they took their work seriously even if no one else did. They were positioned strategically in a corner or on a raised platform, close enough to be heard over the crowd, far enough to not interfere with the dancing. They wore their finest clothes, though nothing as grand as the guests, and they arranged their music stands and tuned their instruments while the ballroom filled. Once the first guests arrived and the hostess gave the signal, they began to play. And they didn't stop. For hours. The repertoire was demanding. Quadrilles, country dances, cotillions, waltzes, reels, each required different tempos, different styles, different levels of energy. The musicians had to transition smoothly between dances, watch for cues from the dance master or hostess, and adjust their volume based on the crowd. Too soft and no one could hear them over the conversation. Too loud and people couldn't talk between figures. And there was no amplification, no sound system. Every note was produced by physical effort, bows dragging across strings, fingers hammering keys, breath pushing through woodwinds. By the second hour, violinists' arms ached. By the third hour, cellists' backs screamed. By midnight, everyone's fingers were cramping, and yet they played on because stopping wasn't an option. The dancing didn't stop, so neither did the music. They received minimal recognition. Guests barely glanced at them. No one applauded between songs. That would be gauche, like clapping for the furniture. The musicians were servants of a sort, functional, necessary, but not acknowledged. If the music was good, it was expected. If it was bad, it was noticed and criticised. There was no winning, only the absence of complaint. Some guests treated the orchestra worse than furniture. They stood directly in front of the musicians, blocking their view of the dance floor and each other. They leaned against music stands, jostling sheet music. During supper breaks, when the guests left to eat, the musicians might get a brief respite, and possibly some leftover food if the servants were feeling generous. But often they just sat there, resting their instruments, flexing their cramping hands and preparing for the next round. The music itself was a mix of classical and popular tunes. Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. Their compositions formed the backbone of the evening's entertainment. But there were also folk melodies, country dance tunes, and whatever was currently fashionable in London's assembly rooms. The musicians had to know it all, often by heart, because reading music by candlelight while also watching for cues was a nightmare. And the tempo had to be perfect. Too fast and the dancers couldn't keep up, leading to chaos and potential injury. Too slow and the energy died, the dancing became sluggish and the hostess would shoot pointed looks at the poor conductor trying to keep everyone in time. The musicians had to read the room, adjust, adapt, and never, ever miss a beat. By the end of the night, and these balls often lasted until dawn, the orchestra was exhausted. Fingers were raw, lips were chapped from woodwind mouthpieces, backs ached from hours of sitting, and ears rang from the constant noise. They packed up their instruments, collected their fee from the butler, and slipped out the servants' entrance while the guests, still dancing or drinking or gossiping, barely noticed their departure. The music was the heartbeat of the ball. It set the pace, the mood, the entire atmosphere. Without it, the evening would collapse into awkward small talk and standing around. And yet the musicians who created it remained invisible, anonymous, appreciated only in their absence. The next time you imagine a Regency ball, remember them. The tired violinist, the determined cellists, the relentless pianist, playing until their fingers bled so everyone else could dance. Around midnight, the doors to the supper room would open, and the starving masses would descend like locusts. Tables were laden with cold meats, jellies, cakes, and various mysterious puddings that may or may not have been edible. Everyone tried to eat delicately while balancing plates, glasses, and the remains of their dignity. After hours of dancing, sweating, and making polite conversation on an empty stomach, supper was less of a meal and more of a desperate scramble for sustenance. The announcement that supper was served sent a ripple through the ballroom, heads turned, conversations paused, and suddenly everyone was moving in the same direction like salmon swimming upstream, except in ball gowns and too tight cravats. The supper room itself was usually a separate chamber, decorated with even more candles, because what this overheated situation really needed was more fire and long tables groaning under the weight of the evening's offerings. The food was elaborate, expensive, and designed to impress. But here's the thing about Regency ball suppers. They were always cold. No one wanted hot food at midnight when the room was already 90 degrees and everyone was coated in a thin film of perspiration. The spread typically included cold roast meats, beef, ham, chicken, tongue, if the host was feeling fancy or slightly sadistic. There were raised pies, aspic jellies that wobbled disturbingly in the candlelight, and various salads that had been sitting out for hours and were beginning to develop a questionable texture. Lobster patties, if you were at a particularly grand affair. Oysters, if someone wanted to make a statement about wealth, and also possibly provoke food poisoning. And the desserts. Oh, the desserts. Towers of syllabub, delicate confections of cream and wine that melted on your tongue. Lemon ices, which were the closest thing to air conditioning available in 1813. Elaborate cakes decorated with sugar flowers and architectural ambitions. Trifles layered with cake, custard, jam, and enough sherry to make you question whether this was dessert or a drink. Fresh fruit, if it was in season, arranged into pyramids that looked impressive until someone inevitably knocked them over. But here's where supper got complicated. You had to eat while standing, or perched on tiny gilt chairs clearly designed by someone who hated comfort, while holding a plate, a glass, possibly a fan, and trying to maintain a conversation with whoever had escorted you to supper. Dropping food was mortifying, spilling wine was catastrophic, and trying to cut meat with a tiny fork while wearing elbow-length gloves was an exercise in futility and frustration. Gentlemen were expected to fetch plates for their partners, a chivalrous gesture that quickly turned into a competitive sport as everyone converged on the tables at once. You'd wait your turn, fill 2 plates with a strategic selection of foods, balance them carefully, and then attempt to navigate back through the crowd without dumping roast beef down someone's back. If you succeeded, you were a hero. If you didn't, well, there went your chances of a second dance. Ladies, meanwhile, were expected to eat like delicate birds, tiny bites, no visible chewing, nothing that could possibly be construed as actual hunger. Never mind that you'd been dancing for 3 hours and your corset had been squeezing your stomach into oblivion. You were supposed to nibble a bit of cake, sip some lemonade, and look charmingly satisfied with life. Actually filling your plate and eating like you meant it. Vulgar, unladylike, a sign of poor breeding. The conversation during supper was its own form of entertainment. This was when the most interesting gossip emerged. Who'd been dancing with whom? Who looked like they were forming an attachment? Who had committed the evening's most embarrassing blunder? People spoke in low, urgent tones, leaning close to be heard over the general din, passing rumours like contraband. And then there were the strategic pairings. Supper was the perfect opportunity for a gentleman to claim a lady's company for an extended period without it being a full dance. If he escorted her to supper, sat with her, brought her refreshments, it signalled interest, not quite a courtship, but certainly more than polite acquaintance. Mothers watched these pairings carefully, noting who sat with whom and for how long. By the time supper ended, usually after 30 to 45 minutes, people were slightly revived, definitely fuller, and ready for the next round of dancing. Plates were abandoned, glasses drained, and the masses drifted back toward the ballroom, leaving behind a scene of magnificent destruction. Empty platters, toppled jellies, crumbs scattered across fine linen, and servants who would spend the next hour cleaning up the wreckage. Supper at a Regency ball wasn't refined. It was survival with silverware. Let's be honest, people weren't drinking lemonade all night. Champagne flowed freely, and the punch bowl was spiked with enough alcohol to fell a small horse. By 2 a.m, even the most respectable ladies were giggling too loudly, and gentlemen were slurring their compliments. The evening started innocently enough. Ladies sipped ratafia, a sweet almond-flavoured liqueur that tasted like liquid marzipan, and had just enough alcohol to take the edge off social anxiety. Gentlemen nursed glasses of claret or Madeira, trying to look sophisticated while secretly wishing they were in the card room with the brandy. But as the night progressed and propriety began to slip, the real drinking commenced. Champagne was the star of the show. French, expensive, and absolutely everywhere. It appeared in tall crystal flutes carried on silver trays by circulating footmen who seemed to have an uncanny ability to materialize exactly when you needed liquid courage. The champagne was good, too good, the kind that went down smooth and easy and didn't announce its potency until you'd already had 3 glasses, and suddenly the room was spinning in a way that had nothing to do with the waltz. But the real danger lurked in the punch bowl, that massive crystal monstrosity positioned prominently in the refreshment area like an alcoholic centerpiece. Regency punch wasn't the fruit juice concoction you're imagining. This was a lethal combination of rum, brandy, lemon juice, sugar, and sometimes champagne, all mixed together in quantities that would make a modern bartender weep. It was served in delicate cups that made you think you were being civilized, but 3 of those innocent-looking servings and you were well on your way to making decisions you'd regret by breakfast. The recipe varied depending on the host's generosity or cruelty. Some punch was relatively mild, meant to refresh rather than inebriate. Others were basically alcoholic assault weapons disguised as festive beverages. You never quite knew what you were getting until you'd already committed to the first sip, and by then it was too late. The punch snuck up on you, friendly and fruity until suddenly you were explaining your feelings about Lord Byron's poetry to a potted palm. Ladies were supposed to drink moderately, of course. A glass or 2 of champagne was acceptable. Punch was permitted in small quantities. But moderation is a difficult concept when you're nervous, overheated, exhausted, and the drinks keep appearing in your hand like magic. By midnight, the carefully maintained facade of temperance had cracked. Women who'd started the evening with impeccable posture were now leaning heavily on furniture. Their laughs grew louder, their fans fluttered more dramatically, and their opinions about other guests became significantly less filtered. Gentlemen, freed from even the pretense of moderation, fared worse. They started in the ballroom, with claret, progressed to champagne during the dancing, hit the punch bowl during supper, and if they ventured into the card room or smoking room, encountered brandy, port, and whiskey. By 2 a.m, cravats were loosened, faces were flushed, and more than one gentleman had to be steered away from inappropriate declarations of affection or poorly thought-out challenges to duel. The servants knew exactly what was happening. They'd seen it 100 times before, the gradual descent from elegant sobriety to champagne-soaked chaos. They kept the drinks coming because that was their job, but they also kept mental notes on who'd had too much, who needed to be subtly redirected away from scandal, and who was likely to vomit in the shrubbery before dawn. Chaperones tried to monitor their charges' consumption, but after their own glass or 3 of punch, because really, how else were you supposed to survive watching 17-year-olds flirt for 6 hours straight? Their vigilance wavered. This was when the truly questionable decisions happened. The too intimate conversations, the agreements to meet in the garden, the promises made under the influence of alcohol and candlelight that would seem absolutely insane by morning. The hostess, meanwhile, calculated her success partly by how much alcohol was consumed. Empty bottles meant a successful party. A crowd that stayed until dawn meant excellent beverages, but it also meant she'd be finding drunk guests in various states of dishevelment throughout her house until sunrise, passed out in libraries, embracing in corridors, crying in retiring rooms, or engaged in heated political debates with the marble statuary. By the time the sun began to rise, the distinction between tipsy and thoroughly intoxicated had thoroughly blurred. People who'd arrived as paragons of respectability were now hanging on to their dignity by a thread, and their friends' arms. The punch bowl, once full and inviting, sat empty and slightly accusatory, its remaining ice melted into a puddle of regret. Tomorrow would bring hangovers, mortification, and desperate attempts to remember exactly what had been said to whom. But tonight, the champagne was still cold, and that was all that mattered. Information travelled at lightning speed at Regency balls, and not because of technology, because of gossip. One whispered conversation behind a potted plant could be common knowledge within 15 minutes. Did Lord So-and-so dance twice with Miss What's-Your-Face? Scandal! Was someone seen disappearing into the garden? Ruined. The rumour mill never slept. The gossip network at a Regency ball operated with the efficiency of a military intelligence operation, except instead of national security, the stakes were reputations, engagements, and social standing. Every conversation was potential ammunition. Every interaction was analysed, interpreted, and transmitted faster than you could say, "Did you see that?" It started innocently. Enough! Two ladies standing near the refreshment table, fans fluttering, voices pitched just low enough to seem discreet, but loud enough to be overheard by anyone paying attention, which was everyone. "Did you notice Lady Catherine's daughter dancing with that gentleman? The one with the unfortunate waistcoat?" A simple observation, harmless. But within minutes, that observation had mutated, spread, and evolved into something far more interesting. By the time it reached the second cluster of gossips positioned near the musicians, the story had gained detail. "I heard she's been corresponding with him in secret. Letters, if you can believe it. Her mother would die if she knew." Another 5 minutes, and it reached the matrons seated along the wall. Apparently they've been meeting in Hyde Park, unchaperoned, for weeks. By the end of the evening, the original couple was practically engaged in a torrid affair, planning an elopement and possibly involved in some light treason. The network had nodes, strategic positions throughout the ballroom where information naturally collected and dispersed. The refreshment area, where people lingered and lowered their guards. The edges of the dance floor, where chaperones congregated and compared notes. The entrance to the card room, where gentlemen passed through and dropped casual comments about other gentlemen's gambling debts or romantic entanglements. The retiring room, where ladies fled to repair their appearances and absolutely destroyed each other's characters. And then there were the specialists, the women who made gossip their life's work. They positioned themselves carefully, always within earshot of something interesting, their sharp eyes tracking movement, their sharper minds cataloguing every interaction. They knew who was courting whom, who'd been jilted, who was fortune hunting, who had scandal in their family history, and who was one bad decision away from social ruin. They were walking databases of drama, and they shared their knowledge generously for a price, usually more gossip in return. The currency of this network wasn't money, it was information. If you wanted to know something, you had to offer something in exchange. A tidbit about your own family, perhaps, or something you'd observed about a mutual acquaintance. The exchange was delicate, carefully balanced. Give too much, and you became the subject of gossip. Give too little, and you'd be frozen out of the network entirely, left to navigate the social waters blind. Gentlemen participated too, though they pretended their gossip was somehow more dignified. In the card room, between hands of whist, they exchanged information about other men's finances, hunting prowess, mistresses, and political leanings. Heard Morrison lost 5,000 at White's last Tuesday. His creditors are circling. Wellington's nephew is sniffing around the Harrington girl. Second son, no fortune, won't come to anything. This was intelligence gathering, they told themselves. Strategic networking, definitely not gossip. The speed of transmission was genuinely impressive. Something happening in the garden at 1 a.m. would be known in the ballroom by 1:15 and confirmed or embellished by 1:30. The network had scouts, young ladies or servants who moved through the house, observing, collecting, reporting back. Information flowed upward to the gossip queens, who processed it, added context, and then released it back into circulation with their stamp of authority. And the consequences were real. A young lady caught in a compromising position, or even just rumoured to have been caught, could find herself facing a forced engagement or social exile. A gentleman accused of dishonourable behaviour might be challenged to a duel or blackballed from his club. Reputations built over lifetimes could crumble in minutes based on nothing more than strategic whispers and raised eyebrows. The only defence was to stay so impeccably proper that there was nothing to gossip about, which was boring and made you socially invisible, or to become so powerful that gossip couldn't touch you. The very wealthy, the very titled, the very connected could weather scandals that would destroy lesser mortals. But everyone else had to walk carefully, speak carefully, and never ever assume that a private moment was actually private. By dawn, when the exhausted guests finally stumbled home, the gossip network was still humming. What had happened overnight would be analysed, discussed, and embellished over tea later that day. Letters would be written to friends in the country, spreading the scandal beyond London. And within a week, what happened at one ball in Mayfair would be known in Bath, Brighton, and every country house in between. The Regency gossip network, faster than the mail, more accurate than the newspapers, and absolutely merciless. Flirting at a Regency ball was a delicate dance all its own, conducted mostly through fans, glances, and carefully worded compliments. You couldn't just walk up and say, "You're hot." No, you had to deploy your fan at strategic angles, flutter your eyelashes at calculated intervals, and hope the object of your affection could decode your semaphore signals. The fan was the most important tool in a lady's flirtation arsenal, part communication device, part weapon, part theatrical prop. It wasn't just an accessory for cooling yourself down in the oppressive heat. It was a language unto itself, a way to send messages across a crowded ballroom without speaking a word. And if you knew how to read the signals, a fan could tell you everything you needed to know about a lady's intentions. Hold your fan open and cover the lower half of your face. I'm interested in you. Close it slowly while looking directly at someone. I find you attractive. Fan yourself rapidly. I'm engaged to another, but thanks for asking. Touch the handle to your lips. Kiss me, which was absolutely not going to happen in public. But the message was clear. Drop your fan. I am yours, or possibly I'm clumsy, but let's assume the former for romantic purposes. Of course, this entire system relied on both parties knowing the code, which wasn't always guaranteed. Many a gentleman completely missed the signals because he was more focused on the punch bowl or mentally calculating his gambling debts. Many a lady sent what she thought was a clear message only to have it interpreted as she has something in her eye or the room is exceptionally warm this evening. Beyond the fan there was the art of the glance. Ladies weren't supposed to stare, that was forward, unladylike, practically scandalous. But a well-timed look, held just a fraction longer than strictly necessary, could communicate volumes. Look away quickly when caught staring. Interested but shy. Hold the gaze and smile slightly. Definitely interested. Raise one eyebrow. intrigued and possibly challenging you to be more interesting, the entire exchange could happen in seconds, and everyone within viewing distance would notice and draw conclusions. Verbal flirtation required even more skill, because everything had to be encoded in acceptable conversation. You couldn't say, "I think you're devastatingly attractive, and I'd like to spend more time alone with you." Instead, you said something like, "I find your observations about the weather quite stimulating," and hoped he understood that you weren't actually talking about meteorology. Compliments had to be oblique, suggestive without being inappropriate, flattering without being excessive. Gentlemen had their own tactics. They'd request multiple dances, the maximum allowable without causing scandal, thereby monopolizing a lady's attention and sending a clear signal of interest to everyone watching. They'd bring refreshments without being asked, hover attentively during conversation, and find excuses to stand closer than strictly necessary. They'd compliment indirectly. "That shade of blue is remarkably becoming, really meant." "You look beautiful and I've noticed. You dance exceptionally well meant I'd like to hold you again, preferably during another waltz." The language of flowers played a role too. A gentleman might present a lady with a nosegay, and the specific flowers carried meanings. Roses for love, obviously. Forget-me-nots for remembrance. Violets for faithfulness. A mixed bouquet could be read like a poem if you knew the code. Of course, this required both parties to have memorized the entire Victorian flower dictionary, which not everyone had, lead into some hilariously misunderstood romantic gestures. And then there was the dance itself as flirtation. The way a gentleman held your hand during a country dance, firmly but gently, with just enough pressure to suggest interest. The way a lady would let her fingers linger when the figures brought them together. During the waltz, the slight decrease in the acceptable distance between partners, the lowering of eyes, the small smile that suggested this particular dance meant more than mere social obligation. Conversation during dancing was its own minefield. You had to be witty but not sharp, engaging but not forward, interesting but not controversial. The goal was to distinguish yourself from every other young lady he danced with that evening, while still conforming to all expectations of proper feminine behaviour. It was an exhausting tightrope walk between memorable and scandalous. The truly skilled flirts could work an entire ballroom, collecting admirers like butterflies, managing multiple subtle courtships simultaneously, without giving offence or appearing mercenary. They knew exactly how many smiles to distribute, which glances to return, which fans to deploy at which angles. They were playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, but the real art was in making it all look effortless. The best flirtation appeared natural, spontaneous, accidental even, as if you just happened to drop your fan near that particular gentleman, as if your eyes had simply wandered in his direction at that exact moment, as if the slight blush colouring your cheeks was from the heat and not from the way he'd just whispered something dangerously close to improper during the promenade. By the end of the night, successful flirtation had accomplished its goal. Interest was established, intentions were signalled, and perhaps an understanding had been reached. Or at least, you'd given him enough encouragement that he might call on you the next afternoon, at which point the whole complicated dance would begin again, this time in your mother's drawing room with even less privacy. Regency flirtation, where saying nothing meant everything, and a fan was mightier than words. If the ballroom was the stage, the terrace was the backstage where all the real drama happened. Couples slipped outside for fresh air, which was code for stealing a moment alone without chaperones breathing down their necks. Some just wanted to cool off. Others wanted to exchange heated whispers or stolen kisses. Either way, being caught alone on the terrace could destroy a reputation faster than you could say compromised. The terrace beckoned like a siren song to anyone who'd been trapped in the hot, crowded ballroom for hours. French doors stood open, ostensibly for ventilation. but really as portals to danger, opportunity, and significantly cooler temperatures. Stone balustrades overlooked manicured gardens. Torches flickered in the darkness, and the night air promised relief from the oppressive heat of 300 bodies and 1,000 candles. The official reason for stepping outside was always innocent. I need some air. I'm feeling rather warm. I thought I might look at the stars. No one ever said I'm hoping to engage in mildly scandalous behaviour away from my chaperone's line of sight. But that was often the subtext. The terrace existed in a liminal space between proper and improper, acceptable and dangerous, visible and hidden. Smart couples timed their exits carefully. Never together, that would be too obvious. She'd slip out first, citing the heat, fanning herself dramatically, and position herself near the balustrade, looking contemplatively at the garden, as if deeply moved by the romantic beauty of the night. He'd wait a few minutes, then casually make his way outside, as if he'd only just thought of getting some air himself. Their meeting would appear coincidental to anyone watching. Everyone watching knew better. The terrace was visible from the ballroom, which provided a thin veneer of propriety. Chaperones could glance out periodically and confirm their charges were still technically in view, but the lighting was dim, the shadows deep, and the distance just far enough that details were obscured. You could see silhouettes but not expressions. You could confirm presence but not activity. This ambiguity was both the terrace's appeal and its danger. Acceptable terrace, behaviour included. Standing at the balustrade, gazing at the garden, engaging in quiet conversation with other guests, taking a brief walk along the stone perimeter while remaining in sight of the doors, and returning inside within 10 to 15 minutes. Unacceptable behaviour included lingering for extended periods, disappearing around corners, descending into the garden, and any physical contact beyond a gentleman offering his arm. But people being people, and young people in love being particularly reckless people, unacceptable behaviour happened constantly. Couples disappeared into shadowed alcoves for whispered conversations that were definitely not about the weather. Gentlemen who'd been drinking too much punch made declarations they'd regret by morning. Ladies who'd been dancing too close during the waltz allowed just one more breach of propriety. A hand held too long, a compliment whispered too intimately, a moment of connection that crossed the line from flirtation to something more serious. And then there were the stolen kisses, quick, desperate, terrifying in their impulsiveness. Behind a column in a shadowed corner, always with one eye on the French doors watching for chaperones or gossips. These kisses were social grenades. If witnessed, if rumoured, if even suspected, they could force an engagement or destroy a reputation entirely. The risk was enormous. The temptation was apparently worth it. The most dangerous aspect of the terrace was the proximity to the garden. Those steps leading down into the darkness were a threshold. Step onto the terrace and you were still technically respectable. Descend those steps and you'd crossed into scandal territory. The garden maze, the secluded paths, the hidden grottos, those were where reputations went to die and hasty marriages were born. Chaperones knew all this, of course. The vigilant ones positioned themselves near the French doors, watching, counting minutes, noting who went out and with whom. If their charge spent too long outside, they'd materialise on the terrace like avenging angels, all polite smiles and steely determination. My dear, I believe they're starting the next dance. We mustn't miss it. Translation: get back inside before you ruin us all. Gossips loved the terrace. It provided endless material. Did you see Miss Bennet slip outside with Mr. Darcy? Lady Catherine's nephew has been out there for 20 minutes with the Harrington girl. I'm certain I saw them holding hands. Whether these observations were accurate or not barely mattered. The appearance of impropriety was nearly as damaging as actual impropriety. Some couples were legitimately innocent, truly just seeking cooler air, truly just having proper conversation in a quieter setting. But once you'd been spotted on the terrace together, especially repeatedly, assumptions were made. By morning, the gossip network would have you practically engaged whether you'd shared so much as a word. The terrace didn't care about your intentions, it cared about appearances. And then there were the proposals, because apparently some gentlemen thought the perfect romantic setting was a stone terrace outside a ballroom where you were both overheated, possibly drunk, and definitely being watched by dozens of nosy guests through the French doors. But proposals happened there nonetheless, sometimes planned, sometimes spontaneous, sometimes the result of being caught in a compromising position and needing to salvage the situation. The terrace was freedom and danger in equal measure. It was possibility wrapped in risk. And every ball had its terrace stories. The couple who went out and came back engaged, the lady whose reputation was destroyed by malicious gossip, the gentleman who declared his love and was rejected so thoroughly he left the ball early, the group of friends who simply wanted to escape the heat and accidentally became the subject of scandalous speculation. The terrace was a stage, and everyone who stepped onto it became a player in Regency society's favourite drama, the eternal battle between desire and propriety. For those seeking even more privacy or danger, there was the garden maze. Dark, winding, and absolutely perfect for clandestine meetings, the maze was where the boldest couples went when they wanted to risk everything. Of course, it was also where you could get hopelessly lost, stumble upon other scandalous couples, or trip over a hedge and ruin your gown. The garden maze represented the final frontier of acceptable risk-taking at a Regency ball. If the terrace was flirting with danger, the maze was marrying it. These elaborate hedge labyrinths, popular features of grand estates, transformed at night from charming garden ornaments into shadowy networks of hidden passages where anything could happen, and frequently did. During daylight, garden mazes were delightful diversions. Families strolled through them, children played hide-and-seek, and couples courted under, the watchful eyes of chaperones positioned at the entrance. But at night, during a ball, when the moon provided the only illumination and the hedges cast deep shadows, the maze became something else entirely. Opportunity, danger, and scandal, all wrapped into 8 feet of sculpted greenery. The entrance to the maze was usually visible from the terrace, which meant that any couple descending the garden steps and approaching it was immediately noted by observers. This created a problem. You couldn't sneak into the maze without everyone knowing you'd gone. The solution? Don't sneak. Walk purposefully, as if you were simply exploring the gardens with a group. Then accidentally take a wrong turn and become separated. Or arrange to meet inside, approaching from different angles, hoping the darkness and hedge walls would hide your rendezvous. Once inside the maze, you were theoretically alone. No chaperones, no gossips, no witnesses. The high hedges blocked sightlines from the house. The twisting paths created natural privacy screens. The rustling of leaves masked conversation. It was as close to genuine solitude as a courting couple could get in Regency society, which is precisely why it was so dangerous. Couples met in the maze for different reasons. Some were genuinely in love but forbidden by circumstance, family disapproval, financial mismatch, previous engagements. The maze offered them precious minutes together, stolen moments where they could speak freely, perhaps hold hands, maybe even risk a kiss. These were the romantic souls, the star-crossed lovers, the ones who thought the risk was worth it. Others were less innocent, rakes looking to compromise young ladies into forced marriages, fortune hunters pursuing wealthy heiresses, bored aristocrats seeking thrills, married individuals conducting affairs. The maze was non-discriminating in its hospitality. It sheltered the sincere and the scandalous with equal indifference. But the maze had its own defences. against bad behaviour. It was genuinely difficult to navigate. The paths twisted back on themselves, dead ends appeared without warning, and in the darkness every turn looked the same. Couples who entered planning a quick clandestine meeting often found themselves hopelessly lost, wandering in circles, their romantic plans dissolving into frustrated attempts to find the exit before their absence was noted. And you weren't alone. Other couples had the same idea. Nothing ruined a romantic moment quite like turning a corner and running directly into another scandalous pair, equally mortified to be discovered. Silent, awkward nods were exchanged. Everyone pretended they'd seen nothing. Mutual destruction was assured if anyone talked, so everyone maintained the fiction that they'd simply gotten turned around while innocently exploring the gardens. The physical hazards were real too. Hedges had branches that caught on delicate fabrics, ripping gowns and tearing lace. The ground was uneven, full of roots and stones that turned ankles and sent people sprawling. In the darkness, it was impossible to see obstacles, benches, statuary, fountains, until you'd already collided with them. More than one lady returned from the maze with a torn hem, grass stains and scratches that required creative explanations. For some, getting lost was the point. I'm so sorry. We became quite turned around in the maze, and it took forever to find our way out was a convenient excuse for a prolonged absence. Chaperones were suspicious, but what could they prove? The couple had been in public gardens, not a locked room. They'd been lost, not compromised. Probably. The doubt was enough to start whispers, but not quite enough to destroy reputations, unless someone had followed them and witnessed otherwise. The maze had its own economy of scandal. Being seen entering together was noteworthy, but not catastrophic. Emerging together after an extended absence was more serious. Emerging dishevelled hair, must, clothing askew, leaves and twigs attached to garments, was grounds for forced engagement. The maze provided plausible deniability, but only to a point. And then there were the proposals. Because apparently nothing said spend your life with me quite like asking for someone's hand in marriage while lost in a hedge maze at 2 a.m. But proposals happened there, sometimes genuinely romantic ones where the gentleman had carefully navigated to the maze's centre, where a statue or fountain provided a picturesque setting. Other times they were panic proposals. We've been gone too long. We'll be compromised if we don't get engaged immediately. Servants knew about the maze, of course. Groundskeepers would do a sweep after balls, collecting the detritus of midnight adventures, torn gloves, dropped fans, handkerchiefs used to wipe away tears or lipstick, and occasionally items that suggested activities even more scandalous than kissing. These artifacts were discreetly disposed of. Loose tongues got servants dismissed, and the aristocracy paid well for silence. By dawn, when the last guests finally departed and the maze returned to its daytime innocence, it kept its secrets. The hedges remained silent witnesses to whatever had transpired in their shadows. The only evidence was whispered rumours, knowing glances, and the occasional hastily announced engagement that surprised absolutely no one who'd been paying attention to who went into the garden and who came back looking significantly more flustered than when they'd left. While the ladies fanned themselves and made polite conversation, the gentlemen had their own refuge, the smoking room. Here they could puff cigars, drink brandy, and complain about their wives, debts, and mistresses in peace. It was a testosterone-fueled bubble of privilege where no woman dared enter, unless she was very brave or very desperate. The smoking room was the masculine sanctuary of the Regency ball, a place where men retreated when the dancing became tedious, the small talk insufferable, and the need for stronger drink overwhelming. Usually a book-lined study or billiard room commandeered for the evening, it was transformed into an exclusively male domain where the rules that governed the ballroom no longer applied. The atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke. Not the refined pipe tobacco of earlier eras, but strong cigars imported from the Americas and the Caribbean. The smoke hung in blue-grey clouds near the ceiling, creating a haze that stung eyes and clung to clothing. This was considered masculine and sophisticated, a sign of worldly refinement. That it was also disgusting and probably actively shortening everyone's life expectancy was beside the point. Brandy was the drink of choice here, served in crystal snifters from decanters that never seemed to empty. Not the champagne and punch of the ballroom, but serious spirits for serious men engaged in serious conversation. Which is to say, drinking heavily while complaining about everything. Port and whiskey were also acceptable. The goal was to consume enough alcohol to make the return to the ballroom tolerable, without consuming so much that you forgot you'd promised the next waltz to someone's daughter. The conversation was refreshingly direct after hours of ballroom politeness. That Pemberton girl is an absolute bore. Couldn't string 3 interesting words together if her dowry depended on it. Heard Ashford's creditors are threatening to call in his notes. Won't be able to keep his seat in Commons much longer. The new opera singer at Covent Garden. Now there's a woman worth pursuing. No one pretended to be a gentleman here. They could finally be themselves, flawed, crude, and honest. Politics dominated when the crowd leaned toward the serious. With Napoleon finally defeated and exiled, conversations turned to domestic concerns, the Corn Laws, industrialisation, parliamentary reform. The Tories and Whigs represented in the room would argue passionately, fortified by alcohol and the absence of ladies requiring civil discourse. Voices rose, fists pounded tables, and occasionally someone stormed out vowing never to speak to someone again, at least until the next social event. But mostly they talked about hunting. Endless, mind-numbing discussions about horses, dogs, fox runs, and that one time when Pemberton's prize hound treed a fox in remarkable fashion. These conversations had the virtue of being non-controversial and requiring absolutely no intellectual effort. You could nod along, grunt occasionally, and refill your brandy without anyone expecting coherent contribution. Women were discussed too, though not in ways their chaperones would have appreciated. Which young ladies were considered the season's beauties, who had improved their appearance from last year, who had disappointing dowries despite attractive faces. They evaluated potential wives like horseflesh, breeding, temperament, maintenance costs. The romantically inclined found this depressing. The pragmatic found it necessary. Everyone participated. And mistresses. Good Lord, the mistress conversation. Who was keeping whom, how much it cost, whether she was worth it, and the logistics of managing multiple households without wives discovering the arrangements. These discussions were conducted in the careful code of men who knew walls had ears and servants talked, but enough was said to paint vivid pictures of parallel lives conducted away from respectable society. The smoking room also served as refuge for the socially exhausted. Men who danced their obligatory sets, done their duty by the hostess, and desperately needed escape from the performance of the ballroom. They collapse into leather chairs, loosen their cravats, and finally relax. No one expected witty banter. No one required elegant posture. You could slouch, you could be silent, you could simply exist without constantly being evaluated. Gambling happened here too, though usually just friendly wagers rather than the serious play of the card room, bets on which couple would become engaged by the end of the season, whether young Hartley would finally propose to Miss Livingston, who'd win the next horse race at Ascot. Small stakes, social currency, the kind of gambling that enhanced camaraderie rather than destroyed fortunes. Younger men treated the smoking room like an initiation rite, being invited to join the older gentlemen, being offered a cigar and a brandy, being included in the conversation. It was validation of adult male status. They'd try not to choke on the cigar smoke, sip the brandy without coughing, and nod sagely at discussions they didn't fully understand. Eventually, they'd earn genuine acceptance and become the ones welcoming the next generation. The unspoken rule was absolute. What was said in the smoking room stayed in the smoking room. The confidences shared, the complaints aired, the admissions of financial trouble or marital difficulty. All of it was protected by masculine code. Violating that trust meant social death. You'd be frozen out, uninvited, marked as unreliable. Better to be caught cheating at cards than to be known as a man who repeated smoking room confessions. Eventually, duty called them back. The brandy was consumed, the cigars stubbed out, and the men straightened their cravats and returned to the ballroom, fortified for another round of dancing, small talk, and proper behaviour. They'd re-enter transformed, slightly more dishevelled, definitely more intoxicated, but ready to play their roles in society's theatre for another hour or two before retreating once more to their masculine sanctuary. The smoking room wasn't just a room. It was freedom, honesty, and the privilege of temporary escape from the exhausting performance of being a Regency gentleman. Adjacent to the smoking room was the card room, where fortunes were won and lost over games of whist, piquet, and loo. Gentlemen bet, recklessly, convinced their luck would turn, while others watched in horror as their estates disappeared in a single hand. By dawn, some men would leave the ball significantly richer or significantly ruined. The card room was where the real money changed hands at Regency balls, not in polite theoretical ways, but in actual promissory notes, I owe us, and occasionally the deeds to property. While the ballroom glittered with romance and social performance, the card room operated on colder mathematics, probability, risk, and the eternal human delusion that this hand would be different from the last 17 disastrous ones. Multiple tables were set up, each with its own game and stakes. The low-stakes tables attracted the cautious, the young, and those who'd already learned expensive lessons about gambling beyond their means. Here, the losses were manageable, a few pounds, enough to sting but not to destroy. These tables had conversation, laughter, and relatively good humour even when someone lost. The high-stakes tables were different, silent, intense, focused. These were serious players with serious money, and the atmosphere reflected it. Each card turned, each bet placed, each call made could mean the difference between maintaining one's lifestyle and facing financial ruin. Faces were carefully controlled. No emotion showed. Everyone watched everyone else for tells, for weaknesses, for the slight tremor in a hand that suggested a bluff. Whist was the most popular game, a trick-taking game played in partnerships that required both skill and strategy. Good whist players were celebrated, invited specifically for their playing ability. Poor whist players were tolerated if they had money to lose. The very best players could support themselves entirely through cards, a genteel form of earning that wasn't quite work but also wasn't quite honourable. Piquet was for two players, more intimate, more intense. The stakes could climb dangerously high because there was no partnership to share the losses. You won or lost alone. Piquet games could last hours, each player trying to outmaneuver the other, building scores methodically, or making dramatic plays that could swing the entire game. Loo was faster, more chaotic, and consequently more dangerous. 3 to 8 players, tricks to be won, penalties for losing. The pot could grow alarmingly large, and a single bad hand could cost you everything in it. Loo was where fortunes evaporated fastest, where the reckless and the desperate gravitated, where the evening's worst financial disasters were born. The betting started conservatively, a few pounds on a hand just for interest's sake. But as the night wore on and the alcohol flowed, stakes crept upward. Conservative players bowed out, replaced by those whose judgment was impaired by brandy, champagne, and the intoxicating belief that their luck was about to change. £5 became 10, 10 became 50, 50 became amounts that should have terrified everyone at the table. Women sometimes played, though usually only in the low-stakes games and always under watchful chaperone eyes. A lady who gambled too enthusiastically or too successfully was considered unfeminine, grasping or dangerously clever, none of which were compliments. They played for pin money, for entertainment, but rarely for keeps. The serious gambling was a masculine domain where fortunes and reputations could be staked without the complication of feminine sensibility. But the real drama came when someone played beyond their means. It happened at every major ball. A young gentleman, heir to a decent estate, confident in his playing ability and convinced that tonight would be the night his luck turned. He'd start reasonably, then chase losses, then bet desperately, then finally, pale and sweating, realise he'd just gambled away next year's income, sometimes several years' income. The rules of gentleman's honour demanded that debts be paid immediately. If you couldn't produce cash, you signed promissory notes. If you couldn't cover the notes, you might put up property, a horse, a carriage, a country house, the deed to your estate. The winner would accept with polite grace. The loser would maintain dignity despite internal screaming, and everyone pretended this was perfectly normal behaviour. Some men were professional gamesters, not officially, because that would be ungentlemanly, but functionally. They made their living at card tables, travelling from ball to ball, house party to house party, bleeding wealth from those less skilled or more intoxicated. They were tolerated because they were well-bred, well-dressed, and technically gentlemen, but everyone knew what they were. Smart players avoided their tables, foolish ones learned expensive lessons. The card room also served as informal banking. Loans were arranged, debts consolidated, financial deals struck away from the official channels of business. I'm a bit short until quarter day. Could you spot me 500? These arrangements were binding, recorded in personal ledgers, and failure to repay marked you as dishonourable. Better to be known as a terrible card player than as a gentleman who didn't honour his debts. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the card room had separated into winners and losers. The winners were expansive, generous, offering to buy drinks, suggesting another hand with lowered stakes out of sporting fairness. The losers were quiet, calculating how to explain to their stewards that the estate needed to economise this year, wondering if they could cover the notes before their creditors heard about their losses. Some men left the ball having won enough to fund another season in London. Others left having lost enough that they'd need to retreat to their country estates, marry wealthy heiresses, or take up economising with a seriousness previously reserved for the middle classes. The card room didn't care. It had no loyalty, no mercy, just the cold mathematics of probability, and the eternal churn of wealth from the unlucky to the skilled or lucky. And through it all, the servants kept the drinks flowing, the candles lit, and maintained absolute discretion. They'd seen gentlemen win and lose fortunes in a single evening more times than they could count. They'd watched estates change hands over a game of cards, seen grown men nearly weep when they realised what they'd done, witnessed the casual cruelty of winners and the desperate dignity of losers, and they said nothing. Because in the Regency world, servants who talked didn't stay employed long. The cardroom's secret stayed in the card room, at least officially, though somehow by afternoon everyone in London seemed to know who'd had a disastrous night at the tables. With all that dancing, drinking and general chaos, wardrobe malfunctions were inevitable. Hems ripped, bodices split, jewels fell off and disappeared into the crowd. Ladies retreated to the retiring room in various states of disrepair, frantically trying to pin themselves back together before anyone noticed. Some succeeded, most didn't. The first wardrobe malfunction usually happened within the first hour, a heel catching on a hem during a particularly enthusiastic country dance. You'd hear a small ripping sound, feel the dress give way, and experience that sinking moment of realization that you'd just added wardrobe disaster to the evening's challenges. The tear would start small, barely noticeable, but every subsequent dance, every movement, every step would make it worse until you were basically trailing torn fabric behind you like a sad wedding train. Buttons were constant enemies. Those tiny silk-covered buttons running down the back of your gown, so elegantly fastened hours ago, had a tendency to pop off at the most inconvenient moments. Mid-dance, mid-conversation, mid-promenade. Pop. Gone. And suddenly you're trying to casually hold your dress together while frantically signalling to your friend that you need to retreat to the retiring room immediately before your entire bodice gives up and surrenders. Seams split under pressure. Regency gowns were often made of delicate fabrics, silk, muslin, fine cotton, cut on the bias and sewn with thread that looked elegant but wasn't necessarily built for structural integrity. Add vigorous dancing, tight corsets creating pressure points and enthusiastic movements, and something had to give. Usually it was the side seam. You'd reach, turn, or bend, and suddenly there was significantly more ventilation in your dress than its designer intended. Jewellery was a disaster waiting to happen. Necklaces with clasps that loosened, bracelets that slipped off, earrings that caught on hair or fabric and went flying across the ballroom like small, expensive projectiles. Losing a piece of jewellery at a ball wasn't just embarrassing. It was financially catastrophic if the piece was valuable, which most were. Servants would sweep the floors afterward and collect an astonishing array of lost items, which would be returned to their owners if the servants were honest and if the owners could prove ownership. Hairpins were another casualty. Those elaborate updos required dozens of pins, and over the course of hours of dancing, heat, and general movement, they'd start working loose. First one pin, then another, then suddenly half your hair was cascading down your back in a way that looked less romantic and more, she's been engaged in vigorous activity somewhere inappropriate. Emergency repairs in the retiring room involved stabbing pins back into place while trying to recreate the original style from memory. Shoes were constantly betrayed by their own delicacy. Those thin silk or satin slippers with almost no structural support would tear, split, or simply give up. Heels broke off during dances, ribbons came untied, the sole would separate from the upper, leaving you essentially dancing in fabric socks. Some women kept spare shoes tucked away precisely because shoe failure was so common. Others just suffered through, limping gracefully and pretending everything was fine. Men had their own wardrobe disasters, though they complained about them less publicly. Cravats came untied, losing their carefully arranged folds and looking suddenly sloppy. Coat buttons strained and sometimes gave up entirely under the stress of dancing and reaching. Breeches split, usually along the back seam, which was mortifying and required very careful positioning of coattails to hide until escape was possible. And knee buckles on breeches occasionally chose the worst possible moments to fail. Drinks spilled, which was nearly unavoidable given the combination of alcohol, crowded spaces, and people in motion. Someone would be walking with a glass of punch or champagne, someone else would turn unexpectedly, and suddenly half the ballroom had witnessed a red wine catastrophe across a white gown. The stain was immediate, spreading, and absolutely impossible to hide. The evening was over for that gown, and possibly for the lady wearing it if the gossips decided to interpret the stain as evidence of intoxication rather than accident. Food was equally treacherous. During supper, trying to eat delicately while standing and making conversation inevitably led to accidents. A drip of gravy on silk, a smear of cake frosting across a glove, a lobster patty that fell apart mid-bite and scattered across your chest like edible confetti. You'd try to wipe it away discreetly, but everyone noticed. Everyone always noticed. The retiring room became triage central as the night progressed. Ladies lined up with various disasters. My hem is torn. I've lost 3 buttons. My necklace broke and the pearls scattered everywhere. I think I stepped on my train and ripped out the entire back panel. I don't know what happened to my hair, but it's given up. The ladies' maids stationed there would assess, prioritise and do what? They could with needle, thread, pins and creative problem solving. Some malfunctions were fixable. A quick stitch, a strategic pin, a ribbon tied to hold things together. Others required more creative solutions. A shawl draped artfully to hide a stain, a fan positioned to cover a missing button. Hair rearranged into a simpler style that didn't require the pins that had been lost. And some disasters were simply beyond repair, requiring the lady to either tough it out for the rest of the evening or make an early, embarrassed departure. The truly memorable wardrobe malfunctions became legendary stories, retold at future balls as cautionary tales. The lady whose entire bodice split during a waltz. The gentleman whose breeches gave up mid-bow, revealing significantly more than anyone wanted to see. The celebrated beauty who lost her diamond necklace somewhere in the ballroom, and it was never found, prompting speculation that it had been stolen, though more likely it had simply been swept up and disposed of by an inattentive servant. By the end of the night, no one looked as perfect as they had at the beginning. Hems were torn, ribbons were trailing, hair was falling, buttons were missing, and nearly everyone had at least one visible stain or tear. But by that point, everyone was too exhausted to care. You'd survived the ball, wardrobe disasters and all. The gown could be repaired. Your dignity might take longer. Speaking of the retiring room, this was the Regency equivalent of the women's bathroom at a nightclub, a sanctuary where ladies could catch their breath, fix their hair, cry into their handkerchiefs, and gossip viciously about everyone still on the dance floor. Maids hovered with smelling salts, ready to revive anyone who'd laced their corset too tight or danced too vigorously. The retiring room was typically a bedroom or dressing room commandeered for the evening, furnished with mirrors, chairs, a chaise or two for fainting, and tables covered with emergency supplies. Pins, needles, thread, spare ribbons, cologne water, handkerchiefs, smelling salts, and occasionally stronger medicinal spirits for those who required more aggressive revival methods. Several ladies' maids were stationed there, ready to perform miraculous repairs on very short notice. The door swung open constantly, ladies entering flushed from dancing, overheated from the ballroom, or fleeing from some social catastrophe that required immediate sanctuary. The atmosphere alternated between crisis triage and gossipy tea party, often within the span of minutes. One woman would be crying into her handkerchief over a romantic disappointment, while another cackled about whose dress looked ridiculous, all while a third tried frantically to repin her hair before her next dance. Fainting was common enough that it had become almost routine. The combination of tight corsets restricting breathing, overheated rooms, hours of physical activity, and sometimes insufficient food created perfect conditions for Victorian-style swooning. Ladies who felt lightheaded would stumble to the retiring room, collapse dramatically onto the chaise, and wait for someone to wave smelling salts under their nose, a horrible assault of ammonia that shocked you back to consciousness faster than you could say "I'm fine." The mirrors told brutal truths. Ladies would position themselves in front of them, assessing the damage. Hair that had started the evening in elaborate arrangements now listed to one side or threatened complete collapse. Carefully applied rouge had either melted off entirely or collected in unflattering patches. Powder had caked in perspiration lines. Gowns showed stains, tears and wrinkles that no amount of strategic draping could hide. The mirror didn't lie, and sometimes the truth was devastating. Emergency repairs were performed with impressive speed. Maids could repin an entire hairstyle in under 5 minutes, their fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Tiers were stitched quickly, not beautifully but functionally. Missing buttons were replaced or worked around. Stains were dabbed at with dampened cloths, though everyone knew this mostly just spread the stain around rather than removing it. The goal wasn't perfection, it was good enough to survive the next hour, but the retiring room's real function was emotional support. This was where ladies could drop their social masks and admit how the evening was really going. He hasn't asked me to dance once. She's wearing the exact same dress I wore last month. I think I'm falling in love with someone entirely inappropriate. My feet hurt so much I want to die. These confessions would be met with sympathy, advice, or agreement depending on the audience and the severity of the crisis. Crying happened regularly. Tears of frustration, disappointment, exhaustion, or joy. The retiring room saw them all. A young lady would arrive, face crumpling, and immediately be surrounded by friends offering handkerchiefs and consolation. Sometimes the crying was about something specific, a hoped-for proposal that didn't materialize, an insult from a rival, a public embarrassment on the dance floor. Other times it was just the overwhelming stress of maintaining perfect behavior for 8 straight hours finally breaking through. The gossip in the retiring room was savage. Away from the men and the chaperones, women could speak with brutal honesty. Did you see her hair? Looks like a bird's nest. I heard her family's nearly bankrupt. She's desperate to marry money. He proposed to the Harrington girl. Can you believe it? He's been courting Lady Catherine all season. Alliances were formed and broken in the retiring room. Information was shared, strategies plotted, and sometimes genuine friendships developed in the midst of shared misery. Some women used the retiring room as strategic retreat. If a gentleman was pursuing them too aggressively, or if they needed to avoid someone, they'd hide out, claiming illness or the need to repair their dress. They'd wait 15-20 minutes, then emerge when the coast was clear. Chaperones occasionally caught on to this tactic and would come fetch their charges, dragging them back to the ballroom like reluctant prisoners. The maids saw everything. They heard every confession, witnessed every breakdown, observed every petty rivalry. They knew which ladies were genuinely distressed and which were performing for sympathy. They knew who was having affairs, who was pregnant, who was desperate, who was faking illness to avoid dancing. And they maintained perfect discretion, because talking could cost them their positions. Though occasionally, for the right price or to a trusted friend, information might be carefully shared. As the night wore on, the retiring room got messier. Discarded pins littered the floor, handkerchiefs piled up on tables. The smell became a mix of perfume, sweat, cologne water, and occasionally vomit if someone had overindulged in punch and required urgent assistance. The maids worked tirelessly to maintain some semblance of order, but by 3 a.m, everyone had given up pretending this was anything other than controlled chaos. Some ladies practically lived in the retiring room, emerging only for their designated dances and then retreating immediately. They'd claim they were resting, but really they were avoiding the ballroom's intensity, the pressure of constant performance, the exhausting requirement to be charming and attractive and appropriate for hours on end. The retiring room offered respite, a brief pause in the performance of being a Regency lady. By dawn, when the final guests were preparing to leave, the retiring room looked like a battlefield after the fighting had ended. Exhausted maids sat slumped in chairs, surrounded by the debris of the evening. The chaise where ladies had fainted was rumpled and stained. The mirrors reflected tired faces with ruined hair and smudged makeup. But the evening was over. They'd survived. And in a few days they'd do it all again at the next ball because that was the season, and there was no escape until it ended or you got married, whichever came first. Every great ball had at least one scandal, something so shocking that it stopped conversations mid-sentence and sent ripples of whispered horror through the room. Maybe someone was caught kissing in the library. Maybe a married woman was seen leaving with someone else's husband. Maybe a gentleman proposed publicly and was rejected. Whatever it was, scandal was the secret spice that made every ball memorable. The moment a scandal broke was unmistakable. A sudden shift in the room's energy, like atmospheric pressure dropping before a storm. Conversations didn't just pause, they halted mid-word. Dancers stumbled. Musicians, sensing something was wrong, played quieter. Every head turned toward the source of the disturbance like flowers tracking the sun, except the sun was social destruction and everyone wanted to watch it happen. Sometimes the scandal was witnessed directly. A couple emerging from the garden or library with telltale signs of impropriety, mussed hair, rumpled clothing, flushed faces, guilty expressions. Everyone in viewing distance would freeze, processing what they were seeing, calculating implications, and then the whispers would start. Soft at first, then building like an orchestra warming up, until the entire ballroom was humming with speculation. Other times, the scandal spread through the gossip network before most people even understood what had happened. A woman would whisper urgently to her friend, who'd whispered to someone else, and within minutes the entire ballroom knew, or thought they knew, that something catastrophic had occurred. The details would morph as they spread. She was seen with him became, she was kissing him became, she's run off with him, within the span of 5 minutes and 36 retellings. Public. Rejections were spectacular scandals. A gentleman emboldened by champagne and misreading all the signals would make a very public declaration of interest or even proposal. The lady, caught off guard or simply not interested, would refuse, loudly, clearly, in front of witnesses. The gentleman would be humiliated, the lady would be criticised for her lack of tact, and everyone else would dine out on the story for weeks. Fights between gentlemen were immediate scandal fuel. An insult, often alcohol-fueled, would be delivered. The insulted party would take offence. Voices would rise. Other men would move to intervene or egg them on, depending on their relationship to the parties involved. Ladies would gasp and clutch their fans. Chaperones would look scandalised. And everyone would be mentally composing the letter they'd write tomorrow, describing the scene in excruciating detail. Sometimes the scandal was revealed rather than created. A piece of gossip carefully guarded would be let slip, intentionally or not. I heard she's already engaged to her cousin in the country. Did you know his father made his fortune in trade? Someone said her mother was an actress. In Regency society, where reputation was everything, these revelations could be socially lethal. The victim would often not even realise they'd been destroyed until they noticed the cold shoulders and withdrawn invitations. Infidelity scandals were the most explosive. A married woman dancing too closely with someone not her husband. A gentleman's wife and his mistress both attending the same ball, resulting in a confrontation that everyone pretended not to witness, while absolutely memorising every detail. These weren't just gossip. They were potential duels, divorces, and family disasters waiting to unfold. The ballroom would reorganise itself around a scandal. People would physically move toward or away from those involved. Friends would cluster protectively around victims. Enemies would hover nearby like vultures, enjoying the spectacle. The scandalous parties themselves would either flee immediately, which made them look guilty but at least escape the immediate scrutiny, or try to brazen it out, which required nerves of steel and often made things worse. Hostesses hated scandals at their balls. A minor scandal was entertaining and would be remembered fondly, but a major scandal, one involving violence, public accusations, or behaviour so shocking that it couldn't be politely ignored, reflected badly on them. It suggested poor guest selection, inadequate chaperoning, or insufficient control over their household. They'd try to manage the situation, redirecting attention, encouraging the orchestra to play louder, and pretending absolutely nothing unusual had occurred. Some scandals were strategic bombs, deployed deliberately. A rival would wait for the perfect moment, maximum audience, minimum escape routes, then drop a carefully crafted piece of information designed to destroy someone's reputation. The timing was everything. Too early in the evening and people might forget. Too late and the crowd would have thinned. But right at the social peak, when everyone was present and paying attention, perfect devastation. The aftermath was fascinating to watch. Within minutes, the social hierarchy would shift. Someone previously popular would find themselves suddenly isolated. Their dance partners would mysteriously have other commitments. Conversations would stop when they approached. The cut direct, where someone would look straight through them as if they didn't exist, would be deployed ruthlessly. Social death happened fast and it happened publicly. But scandals also created opportunities. A clever person could use someone else's disgrace to elevate themselves. Console the victim, position yourself as sympathetic and understanding, and suddenly you're the noble friend standing by someone in crisis. Or alternatively, loudly distance yourself from the scandal, proving your own moral superiority and impeccable judgment. The best scandals became legend. Years later, people would still reference them. Remember the Pemberton Ball in 1813, when Lady Catherine's daughter was caught in the library with that fortune hunter? These stories became cautionary tales, entertainment and social currency. They outlived the actual events by decades, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until they bore almost no resemblance to what actually happened. By morning, the scandal would have spread beyond the ball. Servants would carry it to other households. Guests would write letters detailing every shocking moment. By afternoon, everyone in London would know. By the end of the week, it would be common knowledge in Bath, Brighton, and every country house within riding distance. The Regency gossip machine was merciless and efficient, and the victims, some recovered, usually through strategic marriages, family connections, or the convenient arrival of an even bigger scandal that displaced theirs. Others never did. They'd retreat to the country, marry poorly, or resign themselves to spinsterhood or bachelorhood. One night, one moment, one scandal, and an entire life trajectory could be irreversibly altered. That was the power and terror of Regency social life. That was why everyone was so careful, so controlled, so desperate to maintain appearances. Because one slip, one witnessed indiscretion, one moment of weakness, and you could become the scandal everyone remembered for the rest of your life. Sometimes tensions boiled over into challenges. A perceived insult, a stolen dance partner, a wandering hand. Any of these could result in a gentleman slapping another with his glove and demanding satisfaction. Duels were technically illegal, but that didn't stop hot-headed young men from scheduling dawn appointments with pistols. Most were called off, some weren't. The build-up to a duel challenge was usually visible to anyone paying attention. Two gentlemen would be circling each other all evening, their interactions growing increasingly tense. Perhaps one had been courting a lady the other considered his territory. Perhaps an old gambling debt had gone unpaid. Perhaps someone had made a comment about someone else's sister, mother or mistress that couldn't be overlooked without seeming cowardly. The actual challenge was theatre. It required witnesses, formality, and dramatic flair. The insulted party would approach the insulter, usually in a public space where others could observe but not quite hear every word. Voices would be kept low but intense. The conversation would be brief. Then came the moment. The glove removed and either thrown at the other man's feet or slapped across his face. The universal symbol of challenge, borrowed from medieval knights and somehow still carrying weight in the supposedly civilized 19th century. The challenged party had limited options, Apologise immediately, which preserved life but destroyed reputation. You'd forever be known as the man who backed down, the coward who couldn't defend his honour. Refuse to acknowledge the challenge, which was even worse and marked you as beneath contempt. Or accept, which meant agreeing to meet at dawn with weapons and possibly die over something that would seem absurdly trivial if you survived to old age. Most gentlemen accepted. Honour demanded it. Refusing meant social death, which in Regency society was arguably worse than actual death. At least dying in a duel meant you died bravely. Refusing to duel meant living as a pariah, cut from society, mocked behind your back and unmarriageable. Your family would be ashamed. Your name would be mud. So you accepted the challenge, bowed stiffly, and began making arrangements. Seconds were immediately appointed, friends of both parties who would handle the logistics. They discussed terms, pistols or swords, location, usually a secluded field outside London where authorities were unlikely to interrupt. Time, dawn was traditional, partly for lighting and partly because fewer people were awake to witness or interfere, and rules of engagement. The seconds would try to negotiate a peaceful resolution, apologies, retractions, some face-saving compromise that let both men walk away alive and relatively honourable. Most challenges never reached actual violence. Cooler heads would prevail overnight. Apologies would be crafted by the seconds in ways that preserved everyone's dignity. Upon reflection, I believe there was a misunderstanding, was code for, I don't actually want to die over this, but I needed to look tough in front of everyone. These negotiated settlements satisfied honour without requiring anyone to actually shoot at each other at dawn. But some challenges proceeded to actual duels. The gentlemen involved would spend the night writing letters to loved ones, reviewing their wills, and generally preparing for the possibility of imminent death. Friends would try to talk them out of it. Family members would plead. But once pride and honour were fully engaged, backing down became psychologically impossible. They'd rather risk death than live with the shame of cowardice. At dawn, both parties would arrive at the designated field with their seconds, a surgeon, optimistic but prepared for the worst, and possibly a few trusted friends as witnesses. The weapons would be inspected, loaded, and handed to the duellists. They'd stand back to back, walk a designated number of paces, turn and fire. Or in the case of swords, they'd engage until first blood, serious injury, or one party conceded. Most duels ended with minor injuries or deliberate misses. Gentlemen would fire into the air or intentionally aim wide, making their point about courage without actually committing murder. Honour was satisfied by showing willingness to risk death, not by actually killing someone. The seconds would declare honour satisfied. Everyone would shake hands stiffly, and they'd all go home for breakfast as if this was perfectly normal behaviour. But sometimes, rarely but memorably, someone died. A shot that was supposed to miss didn't. A sword thrust went deeper than intended, and suddenly the abstract concept of defending honour became a corpse bleeding out in a field, while his seconds frantically tried to stanch wounds, and his opponent realised he'd just killed someone over a dance or an insult or something equally stupid. The aftermath was messy. Dueling was illegal, so the survivor and all witnesses were technically criminals. Usually authorities look the other way. Gentlemen's affairs, best not to interfere. But occasionally, especially if the victim was well connected or the circumstances particularly scandalous, there would be investigations, arrests and trials. The winner of the duel might find himself fleeing to the continent to avoid prosecution. The ballroom challenge was just the beginning. But it set everything in motion. The posturing, the negotiations, the potential violence, and everyone who witnessed it would talk about it for weeks. Were you there when Hartley challenged Pemberton? Over the Livingston girl? Can you believe it? I heard they're meeting Friday at dawn. The challenge became its own form of entertainment, A real-life drama more engaging than anything happening on the dance floor. Smart men avoided challenges entirely. They swallowed insults, let slights pass, and prioritised survival over abstract honour. But smart men were in short supply at Regency balls, especially after midnight when alcohol had eroded judgment and pride had inflated to dangerous proportions. And so the challenges continued, generation after generation, young men risking everything over nothing, convinced that dying for honour was somehow more admirable than living without it. The glove would be thrown, the challenge accepted, and everyone would hold their breath until dawn revealed whether stupidity or survival had won the day. By 3 a.m, exhaustion had firmly set in. Your feet were screaming, your corset felt like a medieval torture device, and you were fairly certain you'd sweated through every layer of clothing you owned. And yet, the orchestra played on. The dancing continued, because leaving early was social suicide and you'd rather die than be the first one out the door. The exhaustion wasn't sudden. It crept up gradually over the course of the evening, accumulating like debt until suddenly you couldn't remember why you'd ever thought dancing was enjoyable. Your feet, which had started the evening merely uncomfortable in thin slippers, now throbbed with every step. Blisters had formed, popped, and formed again. Your toes were numb, your arches ached, and you still had at least 2 more hours to go. The corset that had been merely restrictive at 8 p.m. had become actively hostile by 3 a.m. Every breath was shallow, laboured. Your ribs screamed for expansion, that the whalebone simply wouldn't allow. You'd developed a persistent lightheadedness that might have been concerning if you weren't too tired to care. Sitting down provided minimal relief because the corset didn't compress differently. It just redistributed the misery. Your legs trembled from hours of standing, dancing, and walking in circles around the ballroom. The muscles in your calves seized periodically, threatening full cramps that would be impossible to hide. Gentlemen fared slightly better in terms of clothing comfort, but their legs were equally exhausted from supporting themselves through countless dances, while also supporting their partners through turns and promenades. The heat, which had been oppressive at midnight, had become absolutely suffocating. The temperature in the ballroom had climbed steadily as the evening progressed. 300 people generating body heat, hundreds of candles burning, and zero effective ventilation combined to create conditions that felt like dancing in a bread oven. Every movement generated more sweat. Every breath felt thick and insufficient. Conversations became simpler because complex thought was beyond anyone's capacity. Lovely evening. Yes, quite. The music is music, indeed. No one had the energy for wit, charm, or even basic coherence. You'd see people staring blankly at each other, mouths moving, but clearly not processing anything being said. The social performance that had seemed so important hours ago now felt like an impossible burden. Dance mistakes multiplied exponentially. People forgot steps they'd known since childhood. Partners collided because no one was coordinating properly anymore. The formations of country dances dissolved into barely organised chaos as exhausted dancers tried to remember which direction they were supposed to turn. The orchestra, equally tired, occasionally lost their place or tempo, creating moments where the music and the dancing were only theoretically related. Some guests had given up entirely on maintaining appearances. Gentlemen loosened their cravats openly, no longer caring about proper dress. Ladies fanned themselves aggressively, making no attempt to look delicate or restrained. Hair that had fallen was left fallen. Stains were ignored. Missing buttons were accepted as inevitable. The collective agreement seemed to be, we're all disasters now, let's stop pretending otherwise. The refreshment table became increasingly popular as a destination that didn't require actual dancing. People would migrate there, claim they were getting punch, and then just stand there, holding glasses, staring into space, Occasionally someone would remember to actually drink, but mostly they were just grateful for a socially acceptable excuse to stop moving. Chaperones were in no better shape. Many had dozed off in their chairs, heads nodding forward, fans still clutched in sleeping hands. Others had given up surveillance entirely, too exhausted to care what their charges were doing. This should have created opportunities for misbehaviour, but everyone was too tired to misbehave. Romance requires energy, and energy had left the building hours ago. The ballroom had taken on a dreamlike, surreal quality. The candlelight seemed to flicker more intensely, creating strange shadows. The music sounded distant, as if coming from underwater. Conversations happened in slow motion. Time itself seemed to have become elastic. Seconds stretched into minutes, but somehow hours passed without anyone noticing. You'd look at a clock and be genuinely shocked that only 15 minutes had passed since you last checked. Some guests had developed the 1,000-yard stare of soldiers after battle. They stood against walls, eyes unfocused, bodies swaying slightly, looking like they were contemplating the fundamental nature of existence, when really they were just wondering if anyone would notice if they sat on the floor. A few brave souls actually did sit on the floor, usually hidden behind potted plants or in dim corners, past caring about propriety. The younger guests were hit hardest. Teenagers who'd been vibrating with excitement at 9 p.m. were now zombies shuffling through the motions of dances they could barely remember. Their first ball had probably seemed like a glamorous dream. The reality, 9 hours of standing, dancing and maintaining perfect behaviour, while slowly dying of exhaustion, was significantly less romantic than they'd imagined. But leaving early remained impossible. Departing before the hostess gave the signal that the ball was ending would be noticed, remarked upon, and held against you. Did you see the Hartley girl left at 3? Clearly couldn't handle a proper ball, no stamina. So you stayed, even though your body was staging a rebellion, even though your mind had gone numb, even though you'd have sold your soul for 5 minutes off your feet. The irony was that everyone was suffering equally, but no one would admit it. If you confessed exhaustion, you'd be seen as weak, unfashionable, not cut out for society. So everyone maintained the fiction that this was perfectly fine, completely normal, and they could absolutely dance until dawn if necessary. Which is exactly what they'd end up doing, because pride was somehow stronger than the screaming of every muscle in their exhausted bodies. And through it all, the orchestra played on. The dancers danced on, the candles burned on. Because this was a Regency ball, and the only acceptable end was when the sun came up or everyone collapsed, whichever came first. Usually it was a very close race. As the night wore on and propriety wore thin, the dances got looser, faster, more reckless. Partners held each other a little too close, spins got a little too wild. Chaperones, exhausted and possibly drunk themselves, stopped paying attention. This was when the real fun and the real danger began. By 4 in the morning, the careful social choreography that had governed the early evening had completely dissolved. The rules that seemed so important at 9 p.m., proper distance, appropriate conversation, supervised interaction, were now treated as polite suggestions that no one had the energy to enforce. The late-night waltz was where exhaustion, alcohol, and accumulated romantic tension collided in ways that would have caused absolute scandals 6 hours earlier. Partners who'd maintained scrupulous distance during earlier dances now held each other with barely a whisper of space between them. The gentleman's hand on the lady's waist pressed more firmly. Her hand on his shoulder gripped tighter. Their clasped hands intertwined rather than maintaining the formal light touch that propriety demanded. They were essentially embracing while moving to music, and no one had the energy to be shocked anymore. The spinning intensified too. Earlier waltzes had been measured, controlled, elegant rotations that looked beautiful and felt safe. Late-night waltzes were centrifugal adventures where couples spun faster and faster, the ladies' skirts flying out like a bell, both partners laughing with the reckless abandon of people who'd stopped caring about dignity. Occasionally couples would spin so enthusiastically they'd lose control and crash into other dancers or furniture, which would have been mortifying earlier, but was now just hilarious. The music itself changed character. The orchestra, tired but committed, played faster tempos, more dramatic crescendos. They'd been watching the ballroom all night, and understood that the remaining dancers wanted something different, more energy, more passion, less restraint. The resulting music was louder, faster, more intense than anything they'd played during the proper evening hours. Conversation during these late waltzes became dangerously honest. Earlier in the evening, partners had exchanged polite pleasantries. Now, fortified by champagne and exhaustion-induced disinhibition, they said things that would seem shocking by daylight. Confessions of attraction, admissions of feelings, proposals that were half serious and half joke but might become fully serious if reciprocated. The waltz provided cover. You could always claim you'd been caught up in the moment, overcome by the romance of it all. The boundary between acceptable and scandalous had become thoroughly blurred. A gentleman might lean down and whisper something in his partner's ear that would have caused her to slap him earlier. Now she'd laugh, blush, and whisper something equally inappropriate back. They were playing with fire, but the late hour and mutual exhaustion created a bubble where normal rules seemed suspended. Some couples used the late-night waltz as extended conversation time, barely dancing at all, just shuffling in place while engaged in intense, quiet discussion. From a distance, they looked like they were waltzing. Up close, they were negotiating their future. Would he call on her? Would her family approve? Could they see each other again? These were the conversations that turned flirtation into courtship, and they happened in the stolen privacy of a crowded dance floor where everyone was too tired to eavesdrop effectively. The chaperones, who'd been vigilant earlier, had largely given up. Many were asleep in their chairs, and those still awake were too exhausted to care much about propriety anymore. They'd been watching for 8 hours straight, and their vigilance had worn down to almost nothing. Unless something truly scandalous occurred, like a couple actually kissing on the dance floor, they weren't intervening. A little extra closeness during the waltz. At 4 a.m, whatever. Everyone was tired. This lapse in supervision created opportunities for the genuinely improper. Couples who'd been carefully monitored all evening could finally have moments of relative privacy. A gentleman could steer his partner toward a darker corner of the ballroom. They could dance near the open French doors where the cooler air provided an excuse to linger. They could time their waltz to end near the terrace, then casually step outside for air while their chaperone dozed 3 rooms away. The late-night waltz also revealed true feelings in ways the earlier, more controlled dances couldn't. You could maintain perfect propriety for 1 or 2 waltzes through sheer discipline. But by the 5th or 6th waltz, after hours of building tension, true attraction became impossible to hide. The way partners looked at each other, the reluctance to separate when the music ended, the immediate seeking out of each other for the next dance. Everyone could see who was genuinely interested and who was just being polite. Alcohol had definitely contributed to the loosening of standards. By 4 a.m, most people had consumed enough champagne and punch to significantly impair judgment. What seemed like a good idea at 4 a.m, holding your dance partner scandalously close, whispering suggestions that you meet in the garden, suggesting a level of familiarity that exceeded your actual relationship, would seem insane by breakfast. But in the moment, fortified by alcohol and exhaustion, and the strange intimacy of a late-night waltz, it all made perfect sense. The musicians watched all of this with the weary cynicism of people who'd seen the same pattern play out at dozens of balls. Early evening, restrained, proper, everyone on their best behaviour. Late night, chaos, impropriety, and the kind of behaviour that led to either weddings or scandals. They kept playing because that was their job, but they exchanged knowing looks that said, "Here we go again, another group of aristocrats discovering that rules don't matter after midnight." For some couples, the late-night waltz was the culmination of an entire evening of building attraction. Everything had been leading to this moment. The stolen glances during the quadrille, the intimate conversation during supper, the hand held slightly too long during the country dance. Now in the waltz, with diminished supervision and increased courage from champagne, they could finally acknowledge what had been obvious to everyone watching. The waltz became a wordless conversation. I see you, you see me, and when this night ends, something will have changed between us. But morning would bring consequences. The improper late-night waltz, so thrilling and liberating at 4 a.m, would need to be answered for. If you'd been seen dancing too intimately, questions would be asked. Was this an understanding? Were you courting? Had something happened that required your families to discuss arrangements? The late-night waltz could start courtships or create scandals, and you wouldn't know which until the gossip network delivered its verdict by afternoon tea the next day. As the first hints of dawn crept through the windows, guests faced a critical decision. Stay until the bitter end and prove your stamina, or slip out quietly and preserve what remained of your dignity. Those who stayed were treated to a strange, surreal atmosphere, exhausted dancers swaying mechanically, servants beginning to clean up around them, and the sobering realization that daylight was imminent. The sunrise moment at a Regency ball was both magical and deeply strange. The ballroom that had looked romantic and mysterious by candlelight suddenly seemed tired, shabby even, as grey dawn light filtered through the windows. The candles had burned down to stubs, guttering and smoking. The flowers in arrangements were wilting. The floors were scuffed and sticky. The entire space looked like a theatre set after the show had ended, artificial and slightly sad. Guests became aware of how thoroughly destroyed they looked. The kind dawn darkness had hidden stains, wrinkles and disarray. Sunrise revealed everything with brutal clarity. Ladies glanced at each other and saw hair hanging in limp, defeated tangles. Makeup had long since melted or been sweated off. Gowns were creased, torn, stained with punch and who knew what else. Gentlemen weren't better. Cravats hung loose, coats were rumpled, faces were drawn and pale with exhaustion. The decision to stay or leave was fraught with social implications. Leaving now, after 9 or 10 hours, was perfectly acceptable. You'd fulfilled your social obligations, danced with everyone required, and demonstrated appropriate stamina. But there was cachet in being one of the last guests standing, quite literally. Those who remained until the hostess officially ended the ball could claim superior endurance, deeper devotion to social duty, and a certain hardcore quality that marked them as true society warriors. But staying had costs. You'd be seen in full daylight looking absolutely wrecked. The ride home would happen during morning hours when servants and early-rising merchants would see your carriage rolling through London streets, its occupants clearly returning from a night of debauchery, and you'd arrive home to sleep away most of the day, which meant missing afternoon calls and other social obligations, which could be its own social problem. Some guests chose a strategic middle departure, not too early to seem weak, not so late as to seem desperate or lacking in other obligations. They'd make their excuses to the hostess around 4:30 or 5 a.m, claim early appointments or family obligations, and slip out while still claiming they'd have loved to stay longer. This allowed them to escape before full daylight, while still demonstrating adequate commitment to the evening. The hardy souls who remained experienced a strange twilight world. The orchestra, exhausted, played more slowly, sometimes making mistakes they'd never have made hours earlier. Dancers moved like sleepwalkers, still going through the motions but with none of the earlier energy or enthusiasm. Conversations happened in near whispers, as if everyone had collectively agreed that loud voices were too much effort. Servants began cleaning operations around the remaining guests, a not-so-subtle hint that perhaps people should consider going home. They'd sweep around dancers' feet, collect abandoned glasses from surfaces, snuff candles that had finally burned down completely. Some guests took the hint. Others, too stubborn or too drunk to notice, continued dancing in an increasingly empty ballroom. The refreshment tables were depleted and sad. The punch bowl was empty except for some floating fruit debris. The champagne was gone. All that remained were dregs of warm lemonade and some picked-over food that no one in their right mind would eat. But some guests, delirious with exhaustion, would nibble on stale cake or dried-out sandwiches because their bodies were demanding fuel, even if their minds had shut down. The social dynamics shifted dramatically with the diminished numbers. Earlier, the ballroom had been crowded enough to provide cover for awkwardness. Now, with perhaps 20 people remaining in a space designed for 300, every interaction was visible and slightly uncomfortable. You couldn't hide in corners or blend into the crowd. If you were still there, everyone knew it, and everyone could see exactly what you were doing. Some of the remaining guests were there by choice, the truly dedicated partygoers, the ones with legendary stamina, the society figures who made it a point of pride to close down every ball. Others were there by necessity. They'd drunk too much to safely leave, needed to sober up before facing their families, or were waiting for a situation to resolve itself. A potential proposal, a scandal to die down, a rival to finally depart. The hostess, if she was still awake and functional, moved among the remaining guests with a mixture of appreciation and barely concealed desperation. She was glad they'd stayed, proving her ball was successful enough to last until dawn, but she was also exhausted, wanted to collapse into bed, and needed everyone to leave so she could do that. Her smiles grew more fixed. Her suggestions that perhaps people had early obligations grew more direct. The moment dawn truly broke, when full sunlight streamed through the windows and birds began singing outside, was the official death of the ball's magic. There was no pretending any more that this was a romantic candlelit evening. This was morning. People had been awake all night. They looked terrible, felt worse, and were still standing in a ballroom pretending this was normal behaviour. The final dancers swayed through one last waltz, more from momentum than intention. The musicians played automatically, their fingers moving from muscle memory since their brains had checked out hours ago. Servants stood by the doors, holding cloaks and pelisses, silently willing everyone to please, for the love of God, go home. And finally, mercifully, the hostess would make the official announcement that the ball had ended. She'd thank everyone for coming, wish them safe travels home, and make it absolutely clear that it was time to leave. The remaining guests would collect their things, make their exhausted goodbyes, and stumble out into bright morning sunshine, squinting like vampires and immediately regretting every decision that had led to this moment. The carriage ride home would be silent except for the sound of wheels on cobblestones. Passengers would doze against the walls, too tired to maintain proper posture, and when they finally reached their homes they'd collapse into bed still wearing half their ball attire, too exhausted to properly undress, and sleep the sleep of the thoroughly dead until late afternoon when they'd wake up, remember everything, and start contemplating what fresh horrors the gossip networks had already spread about last night's events. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed with its memory foam mattress and temperature-controlled room, maybe take a moment to appreciate what you don't have to endure. You'll never have to lace yourself into a corset so tight your organs rearrange themselves. You'll never have to dance for 9 hours straight in shoes with the structural integrity of tissue paper. You'll never have to smile graciously while someone's drunk uncle steps on your foot for the 17th time during a quadrille. and you'll certainly never have to worry that one waltz held a little too closely might result in a forced marriage to save your reputation. The men and women of Regency England who attended these balls weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't slay dragons or win wars. Well, some of them did, but not at balls. What they did was survive a social system that was elegant, brutal, and absolutely exhausting. They navigated complex hierarchies where one misstep could destroy everything. They performed perfection for hours on end while their feet screamed and their corsets crushed and their reputations hung by threads. They smiled through pain, danced through exhaustion, and somehow found moments of genuine joy, connection, and even love in the midst of all that structured chaos. These balls were where futures were decided, marriages arranged, alliances formed, social positions secured or destroyed. They were business meetings disguised as parties, marriage markets wrapped in music and candlelight. And yet, for all their calculation and performance, they were also deeply human. People laughed until champagne came out their noses. They fell genuinely, stupidly in love during waltzes. They made terrible decisions at 3 in the morning and had to live with the consequences by breakfast. They gossiped, they schemed, they hoped, and they endured. So yes, Regency balls were beautiful disasters, triumphs of presentation over comfort, elegance over practicality, social performance over personal authenticity. They were exhausting, uncomfortable, and occasionally traumatic experiences that people somehow remembered fondly enough to attend again and again, season after season, year after year. Because despite everything, the pain, the gossip, the restrictions, these balls offered something rare, a chance to be part of something larger than yourself, to participate in a grand social ritual, to maybe, just maybe, find someone worth suffering through all those waltzes for. The next time you're getting ready for a night out and complaining about uncomfortable shoes or formal dress codes, remember the Regency dancers in their layers of silk and whalebone, their feet blistered and bleeding, their reputations hanging on every glance and gesture, dancing until dawn because leaving early would be social suicide. Remember the servants who cleaned up after 300 drunk aristocrats, the chaperones who stayed awake all night maintaining surveillance, the musicians who played for hours without break because stopping wasn't an option. And be grateful for elastic, waistbands and athletic shoes, for air conditioning and indoor plumbing that doesn't involve chamber pots and public streets. Grateful that you can dance with whoever you want without needing formal introductions and chaperone approval. Grateful that one scandalous moment won't destroy your entire future, that gossip spreads quickly but also fades, that your worth isn't determined by a single evening's performance in front of 300 judges disguised as guests. The Regency ball is gone now, existing only in books and films and our collective imagination. The last candles have long since burned out, the last dances have been danced, the last scandals have been whispered into history. But their legend remains, a reminder of a time when social interaction was ritual, when courtship had rules, when an evening of dancing could change everything. It was ridiculous and romantic, exhausting and exhilarating, beautiful and brutal, and maybe in the end that's why we're still fascinated by these balls 2 centuries later. Because they were so perfectly, gloriously human, people doing their best to navigate impossible social rules while dealing with basic human needs, desires, and the universal truth that no matter how elegant the setting, everyone eventually sweats through their fancy clothes and makes questionable decisions after too much champagne. So sleep well tonight, comfortable in the knowledge that you'll never have to survive a Regency ball. But maybe, just maybe, dream about the music, the candlelight, the swirl of dancers across a polished floor, and that one perfect waltz where everything else faded away, and just for a moment, the magic was real. Sweet dreams. Try not to wake up in 1813